Hey everyone, and welcome back. Today, we're taking a deep dive into the world of Greek mythology. But we re-sidestepping the usual suspects like Zeus with his lightning bolts or Ares and his battlefield drama. Instead, we're going to follow a goddess who is arguably the most important, yet most underrated, of all the Olympians, Hestia, the goddess of the hearth, home, and family. We're going to imagine what a typical day of errands looks like for her. And trust me, keeping the heart of Olympus beating is a full-time job. So picture this, while other gods are plotting, fighting, or falling in love. Hestia's day starts with a quiet, steady hum of responsibility. Her first stop is always the great hearth in the center of the Olympian throne room. This isn't just any fire, it's the symbolic heart of the entire divine family, the source of their unity and warmth. Before anyone else is even stirring, Hestia is there, tending to the sacred flames. She carefully removes the old ashes, arranges the celestial logs said to be cut from a grove of immortal silver birches and coaxes the fire back to a brilliant, steady blaze. This fire can never go out. If it falters, so does the harmony of Olympus. It's a quiet, meditative task, but its importance is immeasurable. Think of it as the divine equivalent of making sure the Wi-Fi router is working before anyone else wakes up. Absolutely essential. Once the central hearth is secure, Hestia's errands truly begin. She grabs her basket, not for ambrosia or nectar, but for things far more practical. First on her list, a visit to Hephaestus's workshop. The great smith god is usually already hard at work, sparks flying as his hammer strikes the anvil. But Hestia isn't there to commission a new weapon. Instead, she's checking on the braziers and forges. She might point out a crack in a celestial chimney that needs mending. Or ask Hephaestus to craft a new set of fire tongs for a minor deity's temple down on Earth. She has a keen eye for safety and maintenance. Hephaestus, for all his grumbling, respects Hestia immensely. He knows that while he creates with fire, she is its guardian. She ensures his incredible creations don't accidentally burn down the whole mountain. She'll share a quiet word with him, perhaps offering a freshly baked honey cake she prepared, a small gesture of domestic comfort in his world of soot and metal. Next up, she makes her way to Demeter's famed gardens. While Demeter manages the grand cycles of harvest and seasons, Hestia is concerned with something more specific, the kitchen gardens. She needs to inspect the herb patches. Is the sacred oregano pungent enough for sacrificial rites? Is the mint for the after-dinner tea growing well? She chats with Persephone, if she's visiting from the underworld, sharing tips on how to dry flowers to keep the halls of Olympus smelling fresh. Hestia understands that a well-run home, even a divine one, relies on the details. She gathered bundles of herbs, their fragrance filling the air, and thanked Demeter for the bounty. This isn't just about food. It's about providing the small comforts that make a house, a home, a palace, a sanctuary. Her basket now heavier, Hestia's path takes her toward the residential quarters of the gods. This is where her role as a peacekeeper truly shines. Her first stop might be the palace of Zeus and Hera. She doesn't knock loudly or announce herself. She just quietly enters, her presence immediately calming the ever-present tension. She might find Hera fuming over one of Zeus's latest escapades. Hestia won't take sides. Instead, she'll go to their hearth, which is likely sputtering with anger, and gently tend to it. She'll add a log of calming sandalwood, and as the flames burn brighter and steadier, the tension in the room magically subsides. She'll offer Hera a cup of chamomile tea, listen without judgment, and remind her of the importance of their home. She doesn't solve the problem, but she soothes the emotion, which is often more important. She helps them find their center again, all without saying a word about the actual argument. From there, she might swing by the bachelor pad shared by Apollo and Hermes. You can imagine the state of that place. Lyres and winged sandals are probably strewn everywhere. The hearth is likely a mess of discarded snack wrappers and forgotten embers. Hestia sighs, but without any annoyance. With a gentle smile, she tidies up, restokes their fire, and leaves a basket of clean laundry, which she somehow convinced the nymphs who handle weaving to prioritize. She knows that Apollo-S music is sweeter, and Hermes-S messages are faster when they come from a place of order and peace. She's the unseen force of stability that allows them to be their brilliant, chaotic selves. They probably don't even notice the place is clean until hours later, and just assume it magically tidied itself. But Hestia doesn't need thanks. The functioning of the home is its own reward. Her errands also take her to the edges of Olympus. She visits the muses on Mount Helicon. While they inspire poets and artists, Hestia ensures their temple is warm and their inkwells are full. She brings them specially prepared snacks to sustain them during long bouts of creative inspiration. They, in turn, often compose small, beautiful hymns in her honor, celebrating the quiet flame of creativity that she protects. She also visits the Fates, the three stern sisters who weave the destiny of all mortals and gods. No one dares to bother the Fates. No one except Hestia. She doesn't go to ask about her destiny, she's above that. She goes to bring them warm blankets for their cold cave and to check that the light they work by is sufficient. She respects their grim task and offers them a moment of physical comfort, a small act of kindness in a place devoid of it. In return, they give her their silent, profound respect. As the day winds down, Hestia's final major errand is a crucial one. She travels to the threshold of Olympus, the very gate that separates the divine realm from the mortal world. Here, she oversees the ritual of hospitality. When a mortal hero, a newly deceased soul, or a petitioner arrives, it is Hestia's domain that they first enter. She ensures they are greeted with warmth and respect, offered a seat by the fire, and given bread and salt, the ancient symbols of a guest's protection. She teaches the younger gods and goddesses, like Ganymede, the proper way to welcome a stranger. She reminds them that a home's strength is measured by how it treats its guests. This task is paramount. It reinforces the sacred laws of hospitality, known as Xenia, which even Zeus must obey. By managing the doorway, Hestia is essentially the guardian of Olympus's moral integrity. Finally, her long day of errands is over. She returns to the great Olympian throne room. The other gods are gathering for their evening meal, their laughter and arguments filling the hall. They are loud, vibrant, and powerful. And in the center of it all is Hestia. She doesn't take her throne. She gave that up long ago to Dionysus to keep the peace. Instead, she takes her familiar, humble seat by the central hearth. Her basket is empty now, her tasks complete. She watches her family, the chaotic, brilliant, dysfunctional family of gods, and a soft smile touches her lips. The fire she tended in the morning now casts a warm, golden glow on all of them, uniting them. Her work is invisible to most, but without her, the glorious halls of Olympus would be nothing more than a cold, dark, and lonely place. She is the anchor, the quiet center, the eternal flame. So next time you hear a story about a great Greek god, remember the one who kept their home fires burning. Hestia's power wasn't in thunder or war, but in the steadfast, quiet strength that holds everything together. Thanks so much for watching and exploring the unsung heroes of mythology with me today. If you enjoyed this, don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit that bell icon for more deep dives. See you next time. Hestia starts her morning routine with a deliberate calm that feels almost contagious. You trudge behind her as she moves through the stone corridors of Olympus, each step measured, each motion precise. The early sun glints off marble balustrades, and you notice the way the shadows stretch, lazy and slow, across the courtyards. You probably expected gods to start the day with thunder or dramatic proclamations, but Hestia greets the dawn with the gentle, almost imperceptible squeak of her sandals and a soft adjustment of a hearth's embers. Fringe myths suggest that she sometimes whispered greetings to every flame in Olympus, as if acknowledging each fire's unique personality, though historians still argue whether this is poetic exaggeration or rooted in real ritual practice. Her morning begins at the central hearth, the one that represents the heart of Olympus itself. You kneel slightly, instinctively lowering your gaze to the warm glow that spills from the flames, a glow that seems to flicker in sync with her heartbeat. You see her carefully stir the embers, coaxing them to life with practiced ease. Scholars debate whether Hestia ever actually moved between households, or if she existed as a conceptual presence, and you can't help to feel both possibilities are simultaneously true in this moment. The warmth of the hearth seeps into your hands as you hover nearby, and for a brief second, you feel a strange, domestic intimacy with a goddess who otherwise seems impossibly distant. Next comes her wardrobe check. Hestia's robes are simple, practical, and elegant in that understated way that screams eternal order. You notice how each fold falls perfectly into place, and how the faint breeze carries the scent of olive oil from her hair. Fringe accounts say she once folded a toga so meticulously that even Athena paused mid-strategy to admire the precision. Though historians still argue whether such stories were meant to glorify domestic virtues or simply humanize the goddess. You trudge beside her, imagining your own morning routine as if it had been elevated to divine ritual and alarm clock, a cup of coffee, and a whispered "good morning" to every appliance. Breakfast is almost anticlimactic. Hestia tends to a small assortment of offerings: honey, fresh bread, figs, and the occasional ambrosia morsel. You watch her arrange them in careful symmetry, and you can almost hear the faint pop of rising yeast, though perhaps that's your imagination blending with divine presence. Fringe myth whispers that gods sometimes nibbled stealthily from these platters when Hestia wasn't looking, and historians still debate whether these errant tastes were symbolic or literal. You can't help a small smile at the thought of Zeus sneakily pilfering a fig, reminding you that even in Olympus, the mundane and petty coexist with the sublime. Once breakfast is arranged, she begins a silent inspection of the hearths scattered throughout the palace. You follow her along a corridor lined with smaller, secondary flames each, one representing a household, a priestly shrine, or some forgotten corner of divine architecture. The act is hypnotic. She adjusts a log here, gently fans a tiny spark there, and occasionally hums a tune that seems to ripple across the walls. Fringe tales claim these hums could communicate across Olympus, a secret network of vibration that only gods and exceptionally attentive mortals could detect. Scholars still argue whether Hestia's morning inspection was literal or purely symbolic in Greek society. You notice, for the first time, how much physicality this ritual requires. Her hands are steady but deliberate, moving with care yet repeating the same motions hundreds of times across the sprawling palace. The rhythm is strangely soothing, a metronome for your thoughts. You begin to appreciate how tiring even a goddess's chores might be, and you quietly thank whatever divine luck brought you here as a passive observer rather than an active participant. Fringe sources suggest Hestia sometimes paused mid-routine to meditate, aligning her energy with the cosmic pulse, though historians still argue whether meditation as a formal practice existed in early Greek religion. After inspecting all the hearths, she kneels briefly at one particularly stubborn flame, coaxing it to burn evenly. The warmth washes over you, and you feel your eyelids droop slightly, lulled by repetition and ambient heat. You notice tiny ash particles drifting lazily in the light, reminding you that even divine order comes with a hint of chaos. The sound of soft scraping, faint humming, and your own muffled footsteps creates an oddly mesmerizing symphony. You begin to wonder if the mundane nature of her morning routines, so far removed from thunderbolts and epic questies, what truly cements her role as the stabilizing force of Olympus. Finally, Hestia straightens and takes a small step back, surveying the hearths like a gardener admiring a well-tended orchard. You notice her serene smile, one that holds centuries of calm and endless patience, and you feel the tiniest pang of admiration. Fringe legends say that any mortal who witnessed her morning ritual would gain a day of extraordinary calm, and though historians remain skeptical, you find yourself quietly believing it. You realize that the slow, measured motions you've been following, combined with the sensory hum of the palace, have already started to weave a soft, sleepy enchantment over your mind. You trudge alongside her back toward the central hall, following the subtle, invisible pathways that guide her through the morning. The sun is higher now, casting gentle warmth across the courtyards and highlighting dust motes floating lazily in the air. You notice, almost subconsciously, how your steps have slowed to match hers, how your breathing lengthens and softens, and how the outside world, whatever you left behind, feels distant and irrelevant. Historians still argue whether Hestia's presence in private homes was more ritualistic or symbolic, but right now it doesn't matter. You're suspended in her slow orbit, a silent participant in a morning that never rushes, never demands, and never ends. The next task is lighting the eternal flames scattered across Olympus, and you trudge behind Hestia, watching her work with meticulous care. Each hearth seems identical at first glance, yet she treats each one as unique, almost as if the flame itself had a personality. The flickering orange light dances against the marble walls, warming your cheeks despite the gentle morning breeze. Fringe legends claim that Hestia whispered each flame awake with a special chant, though historians still argue whether these chants were ever part of the official rituals or simply poetic embellishments added later. You notice how the sound of her fingers ruffling the embers is almost musical, a gentle crackle that resonates through the quiet halls and makes you want to hum along. You trudge past smaller altars first, each one demanding just the right angle of spark and placement of kindling. The work feels oddly repetitive, yet there's a soothing rhythm in it. You start noticing the subtle differences in color and behavior of the flames. Some lean toward blue, others to gold. Some flicker shyly, others roar with contained pride. Fringe myths suggest that each flame corresponds to a different mortal household or city, making your journey feel like a soft tour through human lives, even if the details are abstracted and symbolic. Scholars still argue whether Hestia ever literally maintained all domestic hearths across Greece, or whether her role was purely divine and conceptual. The larger central hearths are more demanding. You watch Hestia tilt logs, blow softly on embers, and gently rake ash away so the flame grows evenly. Occasionally, she pauses, leans close, and murmurs something almost inaudible. You feel a curious sense of reverence for the smallest motions, as though each adjustment is a sacred act, an unspoken promise that order will prevail. Fringe accounts say that the warmth of these central fires could influence the behavior of gods themselves, softening tempers and smoothing disagreements. Historians still argue whether this was an allegorical notion or a ritualistic practice that shaped social behavior in temples dedicated to Hestia. You trudge across marble floors dusted with centuries of ash, watching her repeat motions over and over. The monotony is hypnotic, and you notice yourself breathing more slowly, your mind subtly syncing with her calm. You almost expect a godly storm to break at any moment, but nothing does. The world feels suspended in slow motion. Fringe myths whisper that the rhythm of Hestia's work could be used as a lullaby for restless gods. And though scholars dismiss this as fanciful, you feel the truth of it in the quiet thrum of the palace. A small, wry thought crosses your mind. If Zeus had to do his own chores, Olympus might literally collapse under the weight of chaos. Lighting each hearth requires precision. Hestia holds small flints over tiny tinder bundles, coaxing sparks to ignite. You watch them flare, leap, and settle into gentle, steady flames. She moves from one to the next with care, never rushing, never missing a corner. Fringe tales claim that sometimes embers from one hearth would magically travel to another, almost as if the flames communicated silently. Historians still argue whether this was a poetic metaphor for domestic unity or a literal belief in the sacred mobility of fire. You trudge behind her, mesmerized, noting the faint scent of smoke mingling with honeyed air and thinking about how even the tiniest spark requires patience and attention. The monotony brings a strange comfort. Each hearth, once lit, seems to breathe slightly under her care, as if acknowledging the goddess's attention. You watch her stand back occasionally, letting the glow wash over the room, adjusting nothing and appreciating everything at once. Fringe legends claim that those who witnessed her tending these flames felt an inexplicable calm for a full day, a sensation you're beginning to understand intuitively. Historians still debate whether this was meant as a form of domestic ritual or symbolic narrative, but the effect is undeniable. The act itself is meditative, a soft pulse of continuity in a world that otherwise hums with divine drama. Even when one of the hearths sputters or struggles to catch, she approaches it without frustration. A gentle blow here, a careful nudge there, and the flame steadies. You feel your eyelids growing heavier as the warmth and subtle crackle wrap around you like a soft blanket. Fringe tales claim that Hestia occasionally carried small charm-like stones to stabilize rebellious flames, though historians still argue whether this was actual practice or a storytelling flourish. You realize that watching this endless, deliberate work the choreography of fire, ash, and hens is oddly mesmerizing, and the mundane now feels quietly heroic. By the time you finish observing the last hearth, Hestia pauses to inspect her work, eyes soft and approving. The palace glows with gentle, flickering warmth, and you feel almost guilty for the small satisfaction you derive from her diligent labor. Fringe accounts insist that the eternal flames once formed a subtle, protective aura over Olympus, though scholars debate whether this is metaphor or religious principle. You trudge alongside her as she walks back toward the central courtyard, each step slow, measured, and comforting. And you notice that even without dramatic battles or divine squabbles, you're completely drawn into the rhythm of her morning. The sun is now higher, casting warm, elongated shadows over the stone floors. Each flame dances differently, reflecting colors off the polished marble. You feel the lulling repetition, the swish of embers, the soft snap of logs. The faint aroma of smoke is almost tactile, wrapping around your senses like a gentle, hypnotic lullaby. You realize that the story, such as it is not an epic conflict, but in the careful preservation of light, heat, and order. Even Hestia's quiet dedication feels monumental. A subtle reminder that the smallest, most patient work often carries the deepest, most persistent magic. You trudge beside Hestia as she gathers trays of ambrosia, each portion meticulously arranged and glimmering in the soft morning light. The honeyed aroma mingles with the faint warmth of the hearths you just passed. You can't help but notice how each piece seems to reflect her careful attention. Tiny golden spheres, delicate cakes, and odd little fruit morsels that almost seem to hum with divine energy. There are fringe stories that claim some ambrosia pieces were enchanted to taste different depending on the mood of the god who ate them. Of course, historians still argue whether this was a symbolic idea or part of an actual ritual practice. You follow her steps, careful not to bump the trays, and feel your own fingers itch to reach out, though, of course, touching the food of the gods is strictly forbidden. Hestia moves with a steady, peaceful rhythm, her robes swishing lightly against the marble floors as she navigates narrow corridors lined with columns. You notice the occasional sparkle of sunlight off polished vessels, each reflecting a soft glow that almost competes with the ambrosia's natural shimmer. Some myths suggest that the trays themselves would sometimes move slightly on their own when she was in looking a subtle magical nudge, ensuring that nothing tipped or spilled. Scholars still debate whether such enchantments were just a literary flourish or if they had roots in real Greek household rituals. But you just watch, fascinated, as Hestia treats each tray as if it were fragile enough to shatter the entire universe. You trudge past Zeus's chambers first, carrying a tray of ambrosia specifically meant for him. The scent of honey and fruit seems to hang in the air, blending oddly with the faint, sharp metallic temps of his thunderbolts nearby. You notice Hestia's careful gaze as she approaches the hearth in his room, making sure the fire is even and steady before setting down the offering. Fringe accounts claim that Zeus sometimes sneaked tastes directly from the tray when Hestia's back was turned, though historians still argue whether these anecdotes were meant to humanize the gods or to teach household virtues. You watch, amused, as the goddess adjusts the arrangement ever so slightly. A faint smile on her lips, almost as if she knows and tolerates his minor mischief. The path continues past smaller deities and minor divine residents of Olympus, each with their own specific tray or dish of ambrosia. You trudge behind Hestia, noting how she hums softly while moving, a tune that seems to echo faintly off the marble, softening the occasional clink of the golden trays. Fringe legends suggest that any mortals who glimpsed this morning ritual would experience a day of good fortune. Even now, you feel a subtle warmth spreading through your chest, a curious mix of anticipation and drowsy calm. Historians still argue whether Hestia's ambrosia delivery was literal, symbolic, or simply an allegory for divine hospitality. But for you, in this moment, it feels very, very real. At one point, Hestia pauses in front of a particularly ornate alcove, carefully placing a small cluster of ambrosia cakes. You notice how she adjusts the pieces until they catch the sunlight perfectly, each casting miniature shadows that stretch across the polished floor. Fringe tales claim that the cake's shadows sometimes formed subtle symbols, letters, numbers, or tiny divine sigils, but scholars remain divided on whether this was a poetic invention or part of a ceremonial observation. You trudge closer, not to intrude, but just to savor the meticulous care she gives to even the smallest, most inconspicuous offerings. It's a quiet devotion that you can't help but admire. You notice your own breathing slowing, matching the gentle rhythm of her movements. Each step, each tray adjustment, each soft hum of the goddess contributes to a strangely hypnotic cadence. Fringe myths say that the ambrosia itself was intended to maintain Olympus's internal balance, a culinary equivalent of the hearth's eternal flame. Historians still debate how seriously the ancients might have taken such practical metaphors. You trudge along the trays, a delicate weight in her hands, and feel a curious sense of camaraderie with this quiet, steady goddess whose errands define the very pulse of her world. It's as if you're part of something ancient and fundamental. Finally, you reach the larger banquet hall, where ambrosia is distributed to gods who sleep later than others or rise early to study music, poetry, or divine politics. Hestia carefully sets the trays along long marble tables, making sure no piece touches another, no plate wobbles. And every golden morsel gleams invitingly. Fringe legends say that the ambrosia sometimes seems to dance in place, catching stray light or subtly shifting shape, though historians remain unsure if this is an exaggeration or some kind of allegorical observation. You trudge behind her, noting the way her hands linger just a moment longer over each placement, as if blessing the room with an invisible calm. The ritual itself, as mundane as it seems, has a deeply calming effect on you. You notice how the hall smells faintly of honey, roasted grains, and warm stone, blending with the soft ambient hum of Olympus waking up. Even the tiniest crumbs seem sacred, like tiny, deliberate gifts to a universe that never pauses. Fringe accounts say that Hestia occasionally tasted a morsel from each tray to ensure perfection, though historians, as always, still debate whether this was literal or symbolic. You trudge alongside her, feeling the hypnotic rhythm of movement and scent, aware that this is a slow, deliberate dance in which nothing happens quickly, yet everything matters. By the time she finishes with the last tray, the hall is immaculate and inviting. You trudge beside her as she steps back, surveying her handiwork, the faintest of smiles tugging at her lips. Fringe tales claim that the scent of these offerings lingered long after the gods had departed, subtly influencing moods and encouraging cooperation. Historians, of course, still argue whether such stories were intended for entertainment, moral instruction, or religious practice. But as you stand there, watching quietly mesmerized, you realize something profound. Even the seemingly boring task of delivering ambrosia carries its own quiet power, its own subtle magic, and its own oddly mesmerizing rhythm. It's a reminder that sometimes the most important work is the quietest. Thanks for joining me on this journey through Olympus. If you enjoyed this quiet moment with Hestia, don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell for more mythological deep dives. See you in the next one. You notice how Hestia sweeps in tandem with the wind, almost as if the broom is an extension of her body, bending to accommodate nature's whims while still asserting order. Every corner presents a small challenge. A stubborn pile of ash here, a scattering of petals there. Hestia pauses briefly, kneeling to sweep delicately under the base of a statue, her fingers brushing away a stray mote that might have seemed inconsequential to anyone else. But the elegance of her movements, though historians still argue whether this was allegorical or actual belief, Fringe myths claim that any dust left uncollected would carry whispers of negligence through Olympus, subtly annoying the other gods, though historians still debate whether this was an actual belief or just moralizing humor. You notice your own steps slowing, your mind syncing with the measured, deliberate rhythm of her movements. You trudge behind her, feeling yourself gradually become part of the rhythm, almost as if you, too, are a minor instrument in this quiet orchestra of order. Fringe tales insist that the courtyard's newfound cleanliness radiates a subtle, almost imperceptible harmony across Olympus, while historians still debate whether such stories were symbolic or believed literally. You trudge beside her, quietly admiring the quiet majesty of her diligence, realizing that in this repetitive, meticulous task, there is a magic that doesn't roar or flash at whispers, hums, and lulls, perfectly suited to a slow, sleepy audience. Hello everyone, and welcome back to the channel. When we think of the gods of Olympus, our minds often jump to the dramatic clashes, the epic battles, and the earth-shattering power wielded by deities like Zeus. His thunderbolts, forged in the heart of a volcano by the Cyclopes, are the ultimate symbols of divine authority and raw, untamed energy. They represent judgment, power, and the chaotic force of the storm. But have you ever wondered who maintains these incredible weapons? Who ensures their readiness? It's not Ares, the god of war, nor Hephaestus, their creator. The guardian of this immense power is a quieter, often overlooked goddess, Hestia, the keeper of the hearth and the heart of Olympus. Today, we're re-diving deep into a story seldom told, the sacred duty of Hestia as she inspects the thunderbolts of Zeus, revealing a different kind of divine strength. Hestia's domain is the hearth, the central fire of Olympus and every home. Her very essence is stability, warmth, and continuity. She is the anchor in the stormy sea of divine politics and mortal affairs. So, it might seem strange that she, the goddess of peace and home, would be entrusted with the most destructive weapons in existence. But it's precisely her nature that makes her the perfect guardian. Where Zeus's power is explosive and outward, Hestia's is contained and inward. She understands that true strength isn't just about unleashing force, but also about controlling it, respecting it, and maintaining its purity. Her inspection is not just a routine check. It's a sacred ritual, a moment of profound communion between the calmest and the most chaotic forces in the cosmos. Imagine the scene. The vault where the thunderbolts are kept isn't a grim, dark armory. It's a serene, circular chamber at the very core of Mount Olympus, directly below the great hearth. The air here doesn't crackle with aggression, but hums with a deep, resonant energy, like the silent moments before a storm. The light isn't harsh. It's a soft, ethereal glow radiating from the artifacts themselves. Hestia enters alone, her steps silent on the polished floor. She wears simple, unadorned robes, her presence bringing an immediate sense of calm to the potent atmosphere. She doesn't approach the thunderbolts as a warrior would a weapon, but as a gardener would a rare and powerful plant, with respect, care, and an intimate understanding of its nature. The very air seems to quiet in her presence, the ambient hum of divine energy softening into a gentle thrum. On a central pedestal, the thunderbolts rest. There isn't just one, but a collection, each unique in its form and power. Some are jagged, sharp-edged spears of solidified lightning, still glowing with a fierce inner light. Others are more ornate, almost scepters of celestial energy, crackling with sparks that dance along their length like living things. And a few are dark, dense, and heavy-looking, holding a compressed, terrifying power within them, waiting to be unleashed. These are not mere metal and magic. They are raw pieces of creation, imbued with Zeus's will and the primordial fire of the cosmos. To touch one unprepared would mean instant annihilation, a fate even a minor god would fear. But Hestia is not afraid. She is here to serve, to maintain the balance. Her inspection begins. She doesn't use tools or instruments. Her senses are far more refined. She extends a hand not to touch, but to feel the aura of the first thunderbolt. Her fingers hover just above its surface, and in her mind, she perceives its entire state. She can feel the flow of energy within it, like a river of pure power. Is it flowing smoothly? Are there any blockages, any impurities that might cause it to misfire or falter? She senses the weapon's history, the battles it has fought, the giants it has struck down, the mountains it has shattered. Each impact leaves a subtle echo, a memory imprinted on its energetic field. Her role is to soothe these echoes, to cleanse the weapon of the lingering chaos of its use, restoring it to a state of pure potential energy. She moves to the next one, a thunderbolt crackling with a vibrant blue light. As she gets closer, a small, stray arc of energy jumps from the bolt towards her hand. But it doesn't strike her. Instead, the energy dissipates harmlessly into the warmth of her own aura, absorbed and neutralized by the steady flame that is her essence. This is the core of her power. She doesn't fight the storm, she calms it. She is the quiet center that the hurricane revolves around. She notes a faint tremor in this bolt's energy field, a sign of recent, intense use. It's like a muscle strained from overuse. With a gentle focus of her will, she sends a wave of calming, restorative energy into it. The frantic crackling softens, the harsh blue light mellows, and the tremor subsides. The bolt settles into a state of rest, its power no longer agitated, but held in perfect, ready stillness. This process is a deep meditation. For Hestia, this is not a chore. It is a form of devotion, a way of tending to the heart of Olympus. She understands that these symbols of destruction are also symbols of order. They are the means by which Zeus maintains cosmic law and protects the divine and mortal realms from the forces of chaos. By ensuring their stability, she is protecting the stability of the entire cosmos. It's a duty that requires immense focus and self-control. A single flicker of fear, a moment of anger, or a lapse in concentration could have catastrophic consequences, potentially causing a bolt to discharge within the very heart of the mountain. But Hestia is unwavering. Her mind is as calm and steady as the eternal flame she guards. She moves through the collection, her hands dancing over each artifact. She is like a divine healer tending to her patients. For a thunderbolt that feels cold and dormant, she coaxes its inner fire back to life, ensuring it is ready when called. For one that burns too hot, its energy threatening to leak out. She gently reinforces its containment, weaving a subtle web of calming energy around it to temper its ferocity. This is a task that requires an intimate knowledge of power. Hestia, who voluntarily gave up her seat on the Olympian Council to tend the hearth, is often seen as passive. But here, in this vault, her true strength is on display. It is the strength of containment, of nurturing, of quiet, unyielding control. It is the power to hold a storm in the palm of your hand and gentle it into calm. As she reaches the final most powerful thunderbolt, the one Zeus wields only in the most dire of circumstances, the very air in the chamber grows heavy. This bolt is different. It doesn't glow brightly or crackle with energy. It is a piece of polished, starless night, absorbing all light, its power so immense it warps the space around it. To even approach it is to feel the weight of eternity. Hestia pauses, gathering her focus. This is the heart of the storm. As she reaches out, she doesn't just feel its energy, she connects with it. For a brief moment, the serene goddess and the ultimate weapon are one. She feels the terrifying, infinite potential within it, the power to unmake creation itself. And in that connection, she reinforces its bonds, ensuring that this ultimate power remains contained, balanced, and pure, a tool of divine will, not an agent of random destruction. Her work is done. The thunderbolts rest on their pedestal, no longer humming with agitation, but with a deep, resonant calm. Their light is softer, their power settled. The chamber feels peaceful, the immense energy within it now in perfect harmony. Hestia gives a final, respectful nod. She has fulfilled her duty. She turns and leaves as silently as she came, the heavy doors closing behind her, sealing the storm away once more. she returns to the great hearth of Olympus, its flames burning brightly, a symbol of the stability she has just reinforced. The other gods may never know the details of her work, the immense focus and power it requires. They only know that when Zeus reaches for his thunder, it is always true, always ready. And it is because of Hestia, the quietest of the gods, the keeper of the flame, and the unlikely guardian of the storm. Thank you so much for joining me on this journey into the quieter side of mythology. If you enjoyed this story, please hit that like button, subscribe for more, and let me know in the comments which often overlooked deity you'd like to see explored next. Until next time, stay curious. You trudge alongside Hestia as she approaches Hera's quarters, where a small, ornate courtyard hosts her prized peacocks. The sunlight glints off their feathers, scattering colors across the marble in gentle arcs. And you notice how the birds strut, as though aware of their audience. Fringe myths suggest that the peacock's feathers could whisper secrets if someone listened closely enough, though historians still argue whether this was metaphorical, symbolic of gossip, or purely fanciful storytelling. You step carefully, aware that even the faintest misstep might send one of the birds into a flamboyant display, shaking out 100 eyes across the courtyard like living fireworks. Hestia moves toward a particularly fussy peacock, lifting a soft cloth to adjust the positioning of a single feather. You trudge quietly behind her, noting the precision of her motions each brush. Each adjustment is deliberate and gentle. Fringe legends claim that these creatures could judge the skill of a goddess handling, their plumage returning a faint nod of approval or a disdainful flick, depending on her care. Though historians still debate whether this was ever taken as a literal belief or merely amusing allegory, the ritual feels strangely soothing, the faint rustle of feathers blending with the whisper of your footsteps. As she tidies the peacock's plume, you notice a faint musky-sweet scent in the air, mingling with the warmth of the morning sun. Fringe myths say that Hera's peacocks sometimes whispered gossip about the other gods, their voices carried only to the attentive, and Hestia, with a calm, almost patient smile, seems to absorb every tiny detail. Historians still argue whether these stories were intended as moral allegories or reflections of domestic observation. But you find yourself charmed by the idea that even these majestic creatures participate in Olympus' endless, slow rhythms. You trudge along as Hestia moves from bird to bird, brushing, straightening, and occasionally stepping back to admire the overall effect. Fringe accounts suggest that one misplaced feather could upset the harmony of the courtyard, though historians remain divided on whether this is literal belief or narrative embellishment. The birds fan their tails, preen carefully, and occasionally glance your way as if silently judging your presence. You notice how Hestia's patience and care seems to soothe even the most temperamental of the birds, a gentle reminder that attentiveness can tame even divine creatures, at least creatures considered divine adjacent. The ritual continues as she checks each feather for alignment, brushing away tiny dust particles that catch in sunlight. Fringe legends claim that the dust from these feathers had subtle magical properties, influencing luck or dreams for any mortal who glimpsed them, though historians still debate the authenticity or symbolic purpose of these stories. You trudge behind her, mesmerized by the combination of vivid color, gentle motion, and ambient warmth. Even the mundane act of grooming seems to carry a subtle, hypnotic power, drawing your mind toward calm reflection. Occasionally, one peacock flutters nervously, shaking loose a feather or two. Hestia bends gracefully, plucking the feathers from the air and placing them carefully back into alignment, as if restoring balance to a miniature cosmos. Fringe myths say that each correctly realigned feather contributed to Hera's mood, stabilizing the goddess's temper for the day, though historians still argue whether this was a symbolic story or rooted in actual ritual practice. You trudge behind, feeling a gentle amusement and faint awe at the goddess's serene command over her work and the creatures themselves. The sun climbs higher, casting golden patterns across the courtyard, and you notice that the peacock's feathers reflect light in an almost hypnotic, shimmering display. Fringe legends claim that Hestia's gentle touch made the eyes of the feathers shine brighter, though scholars remain uncertain whether this is metaphor or fanciful addition. You trudge beside her, noticing how your own steps have slowed, your breathing matching the soft, deliberate pace of the goddess and the calm, stately rhythm of the birds. Even the smallest swish of a tail or the faint clink of a feather brushing stone seems to create an understated symphony of quiet order. By the time Hestia finishes her inspection and grooming, the courtyard feels transformed. Every feather is aligned, each peacock seems settled, and the light plays across the marble in a way that almost invites you to pause and stare. Fringe accounts insist that the courtyard's balance radiated through Olympus subtly, influencing minor events without anyone consciously noticing. While historians still debate whether such stories were symbolic, humorous, or rooted in ritual observation, you trudge beside her, feeling an unusual sense of calm and satisfaction, aware that even these minor, seemingly boring errands hold their own quiet significance in the life of Olympus. You trudge behind Hestia as she enters Hephaestus's workshop, the air thick with the faint tongue of molten metal and the metallic echo of hammer on anvil. Sparks drift lazily from furnaces, catching the light like tiny fireflies frozen mid-flight. And you notice the almost absurd contrast: a goddess of domestic calm navigating a chaos-filled workshop. Fringe myths suggest that Hephaestus sometimes left half-finished inventions lying around, expecting Hestia to straighten them, though historians still argue whether this was literal practice or simply a narrative to emphasize her patience. You step carefully, avoiding stray tools and molten droplets. Already feeling the hypnotic rhythm of the endless clanging and soft swish of her robes, the workbenches are crowded with gears, strange metallic shapes, and half-molten ingots. You trudge alongside her as she picks up a misplaced hammer, nudging it into alignment with the others. Fringe accounts say that some tools emitted faint glows when touched by Hestia, though scholars still debate whether this was a poetic device to highlight her divine influence or an actual part of mythic storytelling. You notice how her movements are deliberate, yet effortless. Gliding through the workshop like a calm current threading through boiling water, she pauses to inspect a nearly completed chariot wheel, running her fingers along the polished metal rim. Sparks flicker gently, as if recognizing her authority, and you notice how the air seems to pulse softly around her presence. Fringe tales claim that if Hestia sensed imbalance in a device, it might never function correctly until she intervened. Though historians remain divided on whether this is symbolic of order imposed on creative chaos or a literal claim, you trudge behind her, feeling the faint warmth of furnaces mixing with the soft hum of her attention, and begin to appreciate the odd poetry of patience in a workshop designed for noise and heat. You observe her picking up small metal fragments, placing each precisely into a labeled container. Fringe myths suggest these scraps occasionally became components of unexpected inventions later, guided by her unseen hand, though scholars still argue whether such ideas were metaphorical or a playful embellishment. You trudge silently, mesmerized by the juxtaposition, molten chaos and gleaming metal, tempered by meticulous, unhurried attention. Even the tiny adjustments, the tilt of a hammer, the alignment of a gear sim like minor miracles, unnoticed by most, but vital to the harmony of the workshop. Hestia's hands hover over a complex contraption, nudging a lever, adjusting a spring, and pausing to observe the subtle tension in the metal. Fringe legends claim that Hephaestus himself occasionally returned to find machines mysteriously balanced, whispering thanks for her quiet interventions. Though historians still debate whether these anecdotes were intended as metaphorical praise or literal stories, you trudge alongside her, noticing how every motion exudes calm authority, how the rhythmic swish of her robes contrasts with the intermittent sparks and hammering sounds, and how even chaos submits to patient care. Occasionally, a small burst of heat or a stray spark arcs toward the ceiling. Hestia doesn't flinch. She simply adjusts her stance, brushes away the debris, and continues. Fringe tales claim that the sparks would form tiny, fleeting symbols mid-air if she passed close enough, though historians remain divided on whether this is symbolic or narrative flair. You trudge beside her, feeling a curious mixture of drowsy fascination and gentle adrenaline, the hypnotic chaos of the workshop tempered by her precise, stertorant, deliberate interventions. The smell of molten metal, mixed with the faint sweetness of olive oil she carries from previous errands, forms an odd, comforting aroma. You notice the subtle sounds, the clinking of tools, the distant hiss of molten metal cooling, the faint crackle of a nearby hearth, and the rhythmic brushing of Hestia's hands over surfaces. Fringe myths say that these noises harmonized the workshop, calming Hephaestus's temper and ensuring no accident occurred, though historians still argue whether this reflects ritual, metaphor, or simple storytelling. You trudge behind her, aware that the work she does here, though invisible to most, sustains both the function and the harmony of Olympus. Finally, Hestia steps back and surveys the workshop. Everything gleams, every tool rests in its place, every unfinished invention seems poised for success. Fringe tales claim that the aura of order she leaves lingers for hours, subtly influencing the work of gods and mortals alike. Though scholars remain undecided on whether this is poetic embellishment or a reflection of ritual thought. You trudge alongside her, noticing the quiet satisfaction in her posture, the almost imperceptible glow of her calm authority, and the strange sense that even in a place of chaos, meticulous care can create a rhythm almost as soothing as the hearths she tends. In the heart of Olympus, beyond the boisterous halls of the gods, lies a place of quiet creation, the study halls of the Muses. Here, inspiration isn't a lightning strike, but a gentle, flowing river, and its current is tended by a silent guardian, Hestia, the goddess of the hearth and home. You might picture her by a crackling fire, the center of domestic tranquility. But her domain extends to any space where a soul finds its anchor, where passion is nurtured into being. And in the grand library of the Muses, her work is more crucial than ever. The sun, a soft golden orb in the ethereal sky of the divine realm, casts long dancing shadows through the colonnades as Hestia begins her day. The air, already thick with the scent of aged papyrus, old ink, and the faint sweet perfume of lyre wood, seems to hold its breath in her presence. She doesn't announce her arrival with thunder or a chorus of nymphs. Instead, she enters like the dawn itself, gradual, inevitable, and utterly calming. Her first task is always the scrolls. The study halls are a labyrinth of towering shelves, each one groaning under the weight of epic poems, untold histories, star charts yet to be deciphered, and melodies that could make the stones weep. Last night, in a flurry of creative fervor, Calliope might have left a dozen scrolls unfurled, her thoughts on the fall of a hero mid-sentence. Terpsichore, lost in a new dance, might have knocked over a stack of rhythmic notations. Hestia moves among this beautiful chaos not with reproach, but with a deep, abiding understanding. Her fingers, long and graceful, ghost over the frayed edges of a papyrus detailing the genealogy of a forgotten dynasty. With a touch, she smooths a crease born from an impassioned reading. She doesn't just stack the scrolls, she feels their essence. This one, she senses, holds a tragedy. Its weight is heavy, the ink dark and dense. She places it near a window where the morning light can touch it, as if to offer it a sliver of hope. Another scroll, light as a feather, and smelling faintly of ozone and laughter, contains a comic play. Hestia smiles, a rare, gentle curve of her lips, and places it beside a collection of satirical verses, knowing they would enjoy each other's company. This is her secret magic. Hestia doesn't command the elements or weave grand illusions. Her power is in harmony, in placement, in the subtle understanding that everything and everyone has a place where it can best flourish. A scroll of philosophy dense with paradoxes, she places next to one on celestial mechanics, allowing their different logics to resonate. A poem of heartbreak finds a home near a treatise on the healing properties of herbs. She is a curator of echoes, a librarian of emotions. Next, she turns to the instruments. An 8-stringed lyre, left leaning precariously against a desk, is carefully lifted. Its wood, polished smooth by centuries of use, feels warm in her hands. She plucks a string. It emits a dull, mournful thud, out of tune, from a night of vigorous composition. Closing her eyes, Hestia hums a low, single note, the sound of a perfectly stoked fire, the sound of a sleeping heart. As her hum fills the air, she adjusts the peg with infinitesimal precision. She tests the string again. This time it sings a clear, perfect note that hangs in the air like a tiny, shimmering star. She continues this process for every string, not just on this lyre, but on all the instruments in the hall, the kitharas, the aloes pipes, even the drums that have been silent for an age. She attunes them not just to a musical scale, but to the very resonance of the room, to the creative potential buzzing just beneath the silence. Her attention then shifts to the tools of the trade. Quills plucked from the wings of Pegasi are sharpened to a needle-fine point. Inkwells, crusted with the dried remnants of midnight inspiration, are cleaned and refilled. The ink she prepares is special. Mixed with a single drop of water from the spring of Mnemosyne, the mother of the Muses, It helps the writer's thoughts flow without stutter or block. She arranges the pots of pigment for the illustrators, not by color, but by mood. The fiery crimsons and golds for tales of war and passion. The deep indigos and silvers for stories of the night sky and prophecy. The vibrant greens and yellows for pastoral poems. As she works, a subtle transformation occurs. The chaos recedes, but it is not replaced by sterile order. Instead, a dynamic harmony settles over the hall. It's the kind of order that invites creation, rather than stifling it. A painter, arriving in despair, will find the exact shade of blue they'd only dreamed of. Sitting right at the front of their desk, a poet, wrestling with a stubborn rhyme, will glance up and see a scroll about the migration of birds, and suddenly the perfect word will take flight in their mind. A musician will pick up a lyre and find its strings already vibrating with the ghost of a new melody. This is Hestia's greatest gift. She doesn't give them the ideas. The muses, in their wild and brilliant glory, do that. Hestia simply prepares the space. She creates the vessel into which inspiration can be poured. She is the steady hand that holds the cup. She is the silent beat that underlies the frantic rhythm of genius. The muses are the storm. Hestia is the quiet harbor that allows the ships to be built, mended, and sent out again. Her final ritual is the lighting of the central hearth. In this hall, the hearth is not for warmth or cooking. It is a flame of pure, unadulterated thought. It does not consume wood. It feeds on the ambient creative energy of the room. When Hestia approaches, the embers are a dull, sleepy orange. She kneels, and she doesn't use a flint or a spark. She simply cups her hands around the hearth and breathes. Her breath is not a gust of wind, but a slow, deliberate exhalation of peace, of focus, of potential. The embers glow brighter, shifting from orange to a brilliant, smokeless white. This is the flame of aletheia, of truth and unconcealment. It casts no flickering shadows, only a pure, steady light that illuminates the deepest corners of the mind. Under its glow, falsehoods wither, and the core of an idea is laid bare. It is a light that encourages honesty in art, a flame that demands the creator be true to their vision. Her work done, Hestia, does not linger. She doesn't wait for thanks or acknowledgement. The muses will soon stream in, their minds already ablaze with the day's projects, and most will not even notice the changes she has made. They will simply find that their work flows more easily, that their tools feel like extensions of their own hands, that the very air seems to hum with a supportive energy. They will attribute it to a good night's sleep, or the favor of Apollo, or simply a lucky day, and Hestia is content with that. She slips out of the study halls as quietly as she entered, her presence fading like the last note of a lullaby. She returns to her own hearth, the center of Olympus, knowing that she has tended another, more abstract home, the home of ideas. For in her profound, silent way, Hestia understands that a story needs a safe place to be born, a song needs a quiet room to be heard, and a masterpiece needs a steady, peaceful heart to guide the hand that creates it. She is the goddess of home, and for the arts, she is the ultimate homemaker. Thank you for watching, and if you enjoyed this journey into the quiet corners of mythology, please consider subscribing for more stories. You trudge behind Hestia as she moves to water the sacred olive trees scattered around Olympus. The air carries a faint earthy scent, mixed with sunlight dust and the subtle temps of olive leaves, and you. Notice how the gentle drip of water onto roots seems almost musical, like a soft percussion accompanying the slow rhythm of her steps. Fringe myths suggest that these trees could sense her attention and grow stronger when touched by her hands, though historians still argue whether this was a literal belief or a symbolic story about domestic and agricultural care. You step carefully around exposed roots, watching droplets glint in the morning sun, hypnotized by the slow, deliberate pace of her movements. Each tree requires precise care. Hestia tilts her water jug just so, letting the liquid soak evenly into the soil. Fringe tales claim that a single misaligned pour could disrupt the harmony of nearby trees, though scholars still debate whether this was meant as metaphorical guidance for ritual practice or literal myth. You trudge along behind her, noticing the soft splash of water on dirt, the gentle rustle of leaves, and the faint hum of life all around you. Even in silence, Olympus seems alive, each tree standing as a sentinel over centuries of God's comings and goings. She pauses at one particularly gnarled olive, tilting the jug to reach every exposed root. Fringe legends insist that this tree once bore fruit for an entire mortal village in gratitude for her attention, though historians remain divided on whether this is allegorical or meant as literal divine favor. You trudge beside her, fascinated by the patient repetition of action, the pour, the tilt, the careful adjustment, the slight shift of soil with her fingers. Each gesture is deliberate, meditative, and oddly comforting in its monotony. The trees themselves seem to respond to her attention. Leaves shiver slightly, almost as if whispering in a language only Hestia understands, and you feel a faint pull of calm spreading through you. Fringe myths suggest that mortals who observed this ritual felt a subtle blessing on their own homes, though scholars still argue whether this was intended as literal belief or symbolic encouragement for household care. You trudge behind her, noticing how even the faintest details, the angle of a branch, the sheen on a leaf, the glint of water contribute to a quietly hypnotic rhythm. You move past older trees, their trunks thick with age and bark worn smooth by centuries of sun, wind, and divine footsteps. Hestia kneels slightly to pour water at the base of one, tilting the soil with her fingers to ensure thorough saturation. Fringe legends claim that the soil would sometimes glow faintly under her hands, indicating the energy of the tree's vitality, though historians still debate whether this was meant literally or as poetic imagery for attentive care. You trudge along, mesmerized by the interplay of water, light, and motion, each small drop echoing softly in the otherwise serene courtyard. She continues down a long row of younger saplings, tilting the jug with near-invisible adjustments to ensure every root receives equal attention. Fringe accounts suggest that each tree's growth was subtly influenced by her presence, their branches stretching slightly toward her as she passed, though historians remain divided on whether this was a literal belief or a charming allegory. You trudge behind her, noticing how your own breathing slows, your thoughts softening to match the gentle, methodical rhythm of watering and motion. Occasionally, a stray olive falls to the ground. Hestia pauses just long enough to nudge it into a neat cluster, maintaining order even among the naturally fallen. Fringe tales claim that these carefully arranged fallen olives sometimes became symbols or offerings for minor gods, though scholars still argue whether this was literal practice or narrative flourish. You trudge behind her, enjoying the hypnotic cadence of small gestures repeated across a vast orchard of sacred trees. By the time she finishes the final row, the soil glistens, the leaves shimmer with moisture, and the courtyard seems subtly brighter, infused with a gentle, calming vitality. Fringe legends insist that the blessing of her careful attention lingered in the air for days, and historians still debate whether such tales were allegorical or part of ritual instruction. You trudge alongside her, feeling a soft drowsiness creep in, a gentle satisfaction from witnessing order, care, and patience in motion, and a sense that even the smallest, most repetitive errands can carry quiet, enduring magic. You trudge behind Hestia as she approaches the wine cellars of Dionysus, a cool, dimly lit space where the faint scent of fermenting grapes hangs in the air. Shadows stretch across the stone floor, and you notice how the barrels glint slightly in the soft light, each one marked with careful inscriptions and tiny charms. Fringe myths suggest that these barrels occasionally whispered secrets of their vintage to Hestia as she passed, though historians still argue whether this was metaphorical or simply imaginative storytelling. You trudge carefully, mindful of the occasional trickle of wine on the floor, watching her move with the same meticulous, deliberate attention she gives the hearths, trees, and instruments. The barrels themselves demand subtle care. Hestia tilts a small cask, checking the seal, brushing away dust, and ensuring that the labels are aligned perfectly. Fringe legends claim that a misaligned barrel could sour the spirits nearby or disrupt Dionysus's creative mood, though scholars still debate whether such stories were allegorical instruction or literal belief. You trudge behind her, fascinated by the contrast. She is the calm goddess of hearth and domestic order in a space meant for revelry, yet her presence stabilizes even the chaos of fermentation. She pauses at a particularly large barrel, tapping the side lightly to gauge the liquid's movement inside. Fringe myths insist that the barrels could hum faintly in response, a subtle acknowledgement of her attention, though historians still argue whether this is literal or poetic metaphor. You notice the faint stickiness of grape, residue on the stone, the dim glint of liquid in narrow cracks, and the soft echo of her robes brushing the floor. You trudge along, absorbing the meditative repetition of inspection and adjustment, noting how even tasks that seem purely practical gain a certain quiet poetry in her hands. Hestia moves on to the racks, where smaller flasks and amphorae rest. She adjusts each one ever so slightly, nudging an uneven vessel back into place, wiping a faint smudge from a label. Fringe legends say that the amphorae themselves seem to balance in response to her subtle touch, though scholars still debate whether this represents a symbolic gesture for ritual observance or a fanciful story. You trudge behind her, noticing how the faint scent of wine blends with the ambient coolness of the cellar, creating a calming, almost soporific atmosphere. Occasionally, a tiny spill occurs, a trickle of fermented grape juice onto the stone. Hestia kneels, tilting a cloth to absorb it without leaving a trace, maintaining order even among imperfection. Fringe tales claim that the smell of this careful cleaning lingered, subtly influencing Dionysus's moods, though historians remain divided on whether this is metaphorical or based on actual ritual belief. You trudge beside her, almost hypnotized by the balance of sensory detail and meticulous care, the soft clinks and swishes forming a gentle lullaby for the mind. She pauses to admire a row of neatly aligned amphorae, their glass and clay catching the faint light in perfect symmetry. Fringe myths suggest that a single, poorly placed amphora could ripple chaos through the spirits it contained, though scholars still argue whether this was a literal belief or storytelling flourish. You trudge beside her, noticing the soft hum of fermenting liquid and the occasional echo of distant footsteps elsewhere in Olympus. Even without any dramatic action, the rhythm of Hestia's movement and the precise organization of this dim, fragrant space has a subtle, mesmerizing effect. As she works her way through the cellar, you notice the faint glint of tiny labels, each marked with care, perhaps even centuries old. Fringe accounts insist that Hestia sometimes inscribed her own tiny marks of approval on barrels, a quiet blessing that ensured their integrity. Though historians still debate whether this was ever intended literally or simply added for narrative texture. You trudge behind her, feeling a curious sense of security and drowsy fascination, order imposed upon chaos, attention lavished upon fermenting wine, and the soft, predictable repetition of careful steps. By the time she finishes the last section of the cellar, every barrel and amphora gleams, every label is aligned, and even the faintest traces of spillage have vanished. Fringe legends say that the cellar's subtle harmony contributed to the smooth flow of wine and the calm of Dionysus' mornings, while historians remain divided on whether this was symbolic or believed literally. You trudge alongside her, noting the soothing cadence of her routine, the interplay of scent, sound, and light, and the gentle lull of repetition that carries an almost magical serenity. Even in a space meant for revelry, Hestia's diligent care instills calm, reinforcing the quiet power of slow, methodical attention. You trudge behind Hestia as she ascends the spiraling staircases to the libraries of Apollo, a place thick with the scent of parchment, ink, and sun-warmed stone. The quiet is almost absolute, interrupted only by the occasional whisper of pages or the faint creak of marble underfoot. Fringe myths claim that some scrolls would realign themselves neatly when Hestia passed, as if grateful for her presence, though historians still argue whether such tales were literal or metaphorical. You trudge carefully, noticing the golden light streaming through high windows, dust motes floating lazily in beams, and a faint hum of order that seems to follow her everywhere. Each shelf and pile demands attention. Hestia adjusts books, slightly tilted, straightens scrolls leaning awkwardly, and taps spines to gauge their alignment. Fringe legends suggest that the scrolls could whisper the knowledge within to her, though scholars still debate whether this is poetic embellishment or a reflection of ritual belief in divine oversight of learning. You trudge beside her, hypnotized by the deliberate motions, the soft swish of her robes, and the gentle rhythm of careful hands, restoring order to centuries of accumulated knowledge. She pauses at a particularly old manuscript, smoothing a curled page and gently adjusting its position on the shelf. Fringe myths insist that these ancient texts sometimes hummed faintly in appreciation, though historians remain divided on whether this was ever taken literally or is just a literary flourish. You trudge behind her, noticing how even the smallest adjustments seem to reverberate through the space, giving a sense of harmony to an otherwise immense and silent library. Hestia moves along narrow aisles, brushing dust from ledges and aligning stacks with a delicate touch. Fringe accounts claim that minor disturbances, like a slightly askew scroll, could subtly influence the balance of knowledge in Olympus. Though scholars still debate whether this notion is literal or symbolic, you trudge behind her, your own breathing slowing, the cadence of her steps, and the soft rustle of parchment weaving a gentle lull over your thoughts. Occasionally, she stops to inspect a larger tome, tilting it carefully to ensure it rests evenly and brushing a speck of dust from its cover. Fringe legends suggest that Apollo himself sometimes glanced in to admire her meticulous work, though historians still argue whether this is allegorical praise or part of mythic storytelling. You trudge along, noticing the faint glow of sunlight on gilded edges, the slight scent of ink and aged paper, and the almost imperceptible hum of quiet attention in motion. She occasionally kneels to adjust lower shelves, aligning scrolls and books in perfect symmetry. Fringe myths claim that her actions harmonized the library itself, allowing knowledge to flow more smoothly to those who sought it. Though historians remain divided on whether this is literal or metaphorical, you trudge beside her, captivated by the hypnotic rhythm of small, repeated motions, the tilt, the adjustment, the soft brush of fingers over surfaces. By the time Hestia finishes her rounds, every scroll is straight, every book aligned, and the air feels lighter, somehow infused with calm order. Fringe tales insist that those who observed her work felt a subtle clarity of mind afterward, though historians still debate whether this is symbolic or was ever believed literally. You trudge alongside her, noticing how even the most seemingly boring errands, dusting, aligning, adjusting, carry quiet magic when executed with patience, care, and gentle devotion. Finally, she pauses in the center of the library, surveying the results of her work with a faint, satisfied smile. The rows of books, the neatly stacked scrolls, and the soft sunlight pooling on the floor create a quiet, almost meditative symmetry. Fringe legends say that this balance could influence the clarity of thought in all of Olympus, while historians still argue whether these stories are poetic metaphor or rooted in ritual practice. You trudge behind her, feeling drowsy, calmed, and strangely inspired by the subtle power of careful attention and steady, patient action. You trudge behind Hestia as she moves toward the guest chambers of visiting deities, a long hallway lined with polished marble floors and tapestries depicting heroic feats that you almost forget exist. The faint scent of lavender and beeswax lingers in the air, mingling with the distant warmth of hearths you passed earlier. Fringe myths suggest that the tapestries themselves might shift subtly to welcome her presence, though historians still argue whether this is literal or a poetic embellishment. You trudge carefully, aware that even the smallest misstep could create an echo in the otherwise hushed corridor. And you notice the hypnotic rhythm of her slow, deliberate steps. Each chamber demands meticulous attention. Hestia adjusts pillows, smooths bed covers, and ensures every tray, vase, and chair sits exactly where it belongs. Fringe accounts claim that even the faintest misalignment could disturb a visiting deity's sleep, though scholars still debate whether these tales were symbolic guidance for domestic order or literal, moral claims about divine hospitality. You trudge behind her, noting the way her movements create a subtle, comforting symmetry in spaces that might otherwise feel chaotic to immortal visitors. She pauses to inspect a particularly intricate bedspread, running her fingers along embroidered edges and straightening folds with careful precision. Fringe legends insist that Hestia's touch could imbue linens with a faint aura of calm, though historians remain divided on whether this notion is metaphorical or literal. You trudge alongside her, mesmerized by the gentle swish of fabric and robes, and the soft scrape of her fingers against polished surfaces, each subtle sound layering into a meditative rhythm. Occasionally, she adjusts small items on side tables, cups, ornamental jars, or delicate lamps. Fringe tales suggest that these items might subtly influence the mood or comfort of a guest deity, though scholars still argue whether this is intended as symbolic or literal belief. You trudge behind her, noticing how the faint scent of lavender combines with the soft echoes of marble, creating a hypnotic lull, and how even mundane tasks acquire quiet significance under her careful attention. Hestia continues down the hallway, checking windows for dust and smudges, letting the sunlight shine evenly into each room. Fringe legends claim that the beams themselves could illuminate a guest's mood more brightly if Hestia passed by first. though historians still debate whether such accounts were literal or allegorical. You trudge along, aware of the comforting cadence of her motions, the repetition of small gestures, and the subtle harmony she creates in spaces that otherwise hum with divine presence. She occasionally kneels to adjust a small rug or straighten a vase, movements so precise that you feel compelled to watch every detail. Fringe myths suggest that her interventions maintained the goodwill of visitors and even encouraged minor divine diplomacy. Though historians still argue whether these accounts were narrative devices or ritual observations, you trudge behind her, feeling a sleepy fascination. The rhythm of repetitive, careful motions softly lulling your mind, while the hallway's muted elegance reinforces the hypnotic calm. By the time she reaches the end of the guest quarters, each room gleams with immaculate order. Every item has its proper place, every surface polished, every corner attended to. Fringe legends insist that her meticulous care could subtly influence the comfort, patience, and generosity of visiting gods, while historians remain divided on whether this was symbolic storytelling or literal belief. You trudge behind her, noticing the interplay of light, scent, and movement, the quiet orchestration of space, and the soft meditative lull that grows stronger with each deliberate step. Finally, Hestia pauses, surveying the guest chambers with a faint, serene smile. You realize that even these seemingly minor, repetitive errands, smoothing a pillow, straightening a vascary, and understated power. Fringe myths say the calm she leaves lingers in the corridors for hours, even days, though historians still debate whether this is metaphorical or reflects ritual practice. You trudge behind her, feeling a gentle, almost sleepy sense of satisfaction. Order imposed, comfort ensured, and the subtle magic of patience quietly unfolding throughout Olympus. You trudge behind Hestia as she heads toward the kitchens of Olympus, where the aroma of roasting grains, simmering honey, and fresh herbs greets you like a gentle embrace. The room is vast, filled with copper pots, clay ovens, and baskets of fruits and vegetables. Each meticulously arranged, fringe myths suggest that some ingredients would subtly rearrange themselves when she entered, aligning in neat rows as if aware of her presence. Though historians still argue whether this is literal or a poetic metaphor. You trudge carefully, mindful of hot surfaces, swaying ropes of garlic, and the occasional stray chicken pecking at the floor, while the hypnotic rhythm of her deliberate steps begins to draw your attention inward. Hestia inspects the hearths first, gently nudging a log into perfect alignment, then checking the embers' glow. Fringe legends claim that a hearth properly tended by her could maintain perfect cooking temperatures without human adjustment, though scholars still debate whether this was literal belief or metaphorical storytelling. You trudge behind her, fascinated by the subtle ways her movements influence the environment. A faint shift in smoke, a gentle warmth, a sense of quiet order spreading through the room. She moves to the preparation tables, aligning bowls, knives, and pestles with meticulous precision. Fringe tales suggest that ingredients could sense her attention, ripening or softening slightly under her gaze, though historians remain divided on whether this was ever believed, literally, or was simply narrative embellishment. You trudge along, noting the hypnotic swish of her robes and the soft scrape of utensils against wood and stone, each motion layering into a quiet, meditative rhythm. Occasionally, she pauses to taste a small morsel of bread dough or adjust a simmering pot, ensuring the consistency is perfect. Fringe myths insist that even the slightest imbalance could affect the meals of gods and mortals alike. Though scholars still argue whether such ideas were allegorical or literal belief, you trudge behind her, noticing the faint scent of warm bread mingling with the earthy aroma of vegetables and the soft golden light reflecting off copper surfaces. She methodically checks baskets of fruit, arranging apples, pomegranates, and figs so that each color and shape creates a harmonious pattern. Fringe accounts claim that Hestia's careful arrangement could subtly enhance the flavor or freshness, though historians still debate whether this is symbolic storytelling or a reflection of ritualized attention to domestic detail. You trudge alongside her, mesmerized by the deliberate repetition, the gentle cadence, and the soft, drowsy calm that seems to settle over the kitchens with each motion. Hestia's attention extends even to the smallest details, wiping smudges from the floor, adjusting a hanging ladle, and aligning jars of honey and oil. Fringe tales suggest that her care ensured the smooth operation of the kitchens for days, influencing not just meals, but the temperaments of chefs and gods alike. Though historians remain uncertain about the literal truth of such claims, you trudge behind her, feeling a strange combination of amusement, admiration, and sleepy fascination at the extent of her quiet authority. By the time she finishes, the kitchens are immaculate. Every pot gleams, every ingredient is neatly arranged, and the air feels both warm and subtly infused with order. Fringe legends claim that a kitchen so tended by Hestia radiated a calm influence across Olympus, subtly shaping moods and encouraging harmony. While historians still debate whether this reflects metaphorical storytelling or real ritual practice. You trudge alongside her, feeling the soft lull of repetition, the interplay of scent, light, and subtle motion, and a deepening sense of calm as you observe the mundane rendered almost magical by devotion and patience. Finally, Hestia steps back, surveying her work with the faintest smile. You realize that even the most repetitive, seemingly boring errands arranging fruit, aligning bowls, adjusting hearth's quiet power when executed with care, fringe myths insist that this calm lingers, settling over Olympus like a soft blanket, while historians still debate whether such tales are allegorical or ritualistic. You trudge beside her, drowsy, reflective, and quietly enchanted by the gentle rhythm of domestic diligence magnified into divine scale. You trudge behind Hestia as she navigates the Hall of Offerings. It's a long, narrow chamber, and the air is thick with the sweet aroma of incense and honey. Small altars and shelves line the walls, absolutely laden with gifts from mortals. I see bowls brimming with golden honey, intricately woven garlands, and tiny, delicate figurines, each one placed with such obvious care and reverence. Soft warmth from sunlight filters through high windows, illuminating dust motes dancing in the air. There are some old fringe myths, the kind historians love to argue about. They claim that some of these offerings would subtly shift and align themselves perfectly whenever Hestia entered the room. Is that literal, or just a beautiful story to represent her presence? It's hard to say. Right now, all you can do is walk carefully, trying to match the quiet reverence in her movements and the hypnotic, steady rhythm of her pace. Each altar demands her precise, undivided attention. You watch as Hestia gently dusts off small figurines, straightens garlands that have drooped ever so slightly, and nudges bowls so that they sit exactly in the center of their designated spots. It's meticulous work. Another fringe legend comes to mind, one that suggests offerings left unadjusted, even by a millimeter, might lose some of their spiritual potency. Again, scholars are torn. Was this a genuine belief, a real concern for the ancients, or was it a narrative embellishment, a story told to emphasize the importance of domestic diligence? The debate is fascinating, but here, in the moment, you're more focused on the sounds. The gentle click of stone and ceramic as she adjusts each item, the soft swish of her robes blending with the profound ambient silence of the hall. It's a symphony of quiet care. She pauses now at a particularly elaborate altar, one dedicated to Hermes. It's adorned with miniature winged sandals and tiny scrolls. She leans in, her focus absolute, and brushes away a single, almost invisible speck of dust from one of the sandals. It's such a small gesture, yet it feels significant. The old fringe myths surrounding this are particularly interesting. They claim that even the tiniest correction, like the one you just witnessed, could subtly influence Hermes' favor toward a mortal. Was this taken literally, a kind of divine transaction? Or was it purely allegorical, a story about showing respect? Historians remain divided. As you stand beside her, you become aware of the soft, almost hypnotic cadence of her repetitive, careful motions. Even this mundane act of cleaning, of dusting a tiny statue, feels imbued with a subtle, palpable magic. It's less about the task and more about the intention behind it. Hestia moves from one altar to the next, a silent, graceful procession. She arranges offerings of fruit, placing them in perfect, pleasing patterns. She adjusts small vessels of oil, ensuring they catch the light just right. She straightens tiny woven mats that sit beneath other gifts. Everything she does is about creating a harmonious balance. You remember reading some obscure fringe accounts that said she sometimes whispered small blessings as she worked. Were these actual prayers, quiet words of power, or was this a literary device used by poets to convey her piety? The scholars, as always, are still arguing. You trudge behind her, almost in a daze. The faint scent of incense, mixed with the soft warmth of the sunlit chamber, is creating this slow, drowsy calm that seems to settle deep into your chest, slowing your own heartbeat to match the rhythm of the room. It's incredibly peaceful. Occasionally, something is out of place. A stray flower petal has fallen from a garland, or a single grain of incense has rolled away from its burner. When this happens, Hestia kneels. There is no sigh, no sign of annoyance, only quiet purpose. She restores order, brushing stray crumbs into neat little piles and adjusting the garlands back to their perfect, symmetrical state. This is where the fringe legends get really wild. Some insist that these small, meticulous gestures could create ripples that subtly spread through all of Olympus, influencing the moods and minor decisions of the other gods. Think about that: a single petal put back in its place, potentially averting a divine squabble. Is it literal or purely metaphorical? Who knows? But as you trudge along, you find yourself captivated by it all. The gentle repetition, the soothing rhythm of her motion, and the quiet. Deep satisfaction of witnessing patience transformed into a sacred ritual. Every so often, she finishes with an altar and takes a step back to survey her work. She tilts her head slightly, her gaze analytical, ensuring that the balance and proportion are absolutely perfect. It's like an artist inspecting a masterpiece. There are some rather charming fringe tales that suggest the gods themselves might observe her from afar, unseen, appreciating the harmony she imposes on their offerings. Were these stories meant as a form of humor, a moral illustration about the value of a well-kept home, or did people genuinely believe the gods were watching? It's another point of contention for historians. You continue to follow her, absorbing the soft cadence of her deliberate motions, watching the interplay of light and shadow as it dances across the polished surfaces of the offerings. You feel a subtle pull of drowsy fascination, making it hard to look away. By the time she reaches the final altar at the far end of the hall, the transformation is complete. Every single offering gleams under the sunlight. Every garland sits in a perfect, symmetrical arc. The faint glow of the sun catches on polished surfaces, creating delicate, beautiful highlights. You recall one of the most powerful fringe myths. It claimed that any mortal who was lucky enough to glimpse Hestia tending the offerings would feel that their prayers were suddenly more potent, more likely to reach the ears of the gods. And as always, historians are divided on whether this was symbolic, part of a ritual, or just a beautiful literary flourish. As you trudge alongside her, you notice the calming effect of it, all the repetition, the symmetry, the gentle care. You feel a quiet sense of awe at the understated, immense power of simple attention and patience. Finally, Hestia steps back, surveying the entire hall of offerings with a faint, serene smile of satisfaction. And in that moment, you have a realization. Even these small, seemingly trivial errands-doing figurines, arranging fruit, aligning bowls, they all carry a quiet magic. In their own subtle way, they influence a world that often seems overwhelmingly chaotic and messy. They impose a gentle order. The last fringe account you can remember insists that the calm she creates here doesn't just stay in this room. It lingers, spreading like a gentle echo of order across all of Olympus. Whether that's metaphorical or a reflection of actual ritual practice, historians will likely debate forever. But for you, standing beside her, you feel drowsy, reflective, and completely enchanted by the subtle, hypnotic rhythm of domestic diligence, magnified to a truly divine scale. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this journey, be sure to follow 4 more stories from the fringes of myth. You trudge behind Hestia as she makes her way to the stables of Olympus, where steeds with shimmering coats and faintly glowing hooves paw quietly at the ground. The air smells faintly of hay, sweat, and polished metal, a combination both earthy and oddly comforting. Fringe myths suggest that some horses could sense her approach and stand more attentively, though historians still argue whether this was literal belief or symbolic storytelling. You step carefully, avoiding stray straw and the occasional clop of hooves, while the soft rhythm of her robes brushing the floor creates a strangely hypnotic cadence. Each stall demands precise attention. Hestia checks harnesses, straightens feed bowls, and brushes the horses' gleaming coats with gentle, deliberate strokes. Fringe legends claim that a perfectly groomed horse was more willing to follow the gods into battle or flight, though scholars still debate whether such stories were allegorical or literal. You trudge behind her, noting how the rhythmic brushing produces a faintly metallic scent mixed with horsehair, and how even a mundane task like grooming becomes meditative in her hands. She pauses at a particularly restless stallion, running her fingers along its mane, straightening knots and smoothing stray strands. Fringe myths insist that the horses could convey minor messages or emotions through their posture, subtly influenced by Hestia's presence, though historians remain divided on whether this was considered literal or metaphorical. You trudge alongside her, mesmerized by the gentle swish of mane and robes, the faint thud of hooves on stone, and the hypnotic cadence of slow, careful care. Hestia moves from stall to stall, adjusting blankets, polishing bridles, and checking each tack for wear. Fringe accounts suggest that a minor oversight could lead to discomfort or misbehavior among the divine horses, though scholars still argue whether these tales were practical advice for ritualized care or narrative embellishments. You trudge behind her, noticing how the combination of motion, scent, and sound creates a lulling, almost soporific atmosphere. Occasionally, a horse shifts or nudges a feed bucket. Hestia bends gracefully to restore order, replacing the bucket, fluffing straw, and smoothing blankets with meticulous precision. Fringe legends claim that the subtle harmony she imposed radiated outward, calming both the animals and nearby deities, though historians still debate whether this is symbolic or literal belief. You trudge along, entranced by the repetition, the quiet interplay of care and attention, and the soothing, rhythmic brushing of coats. She pauses to inspect a particularly massive stall, checking the polished harnesses and adjusting the positioning of a saddle. Fringe tales suggest that her presence ensured the readiness of each horse for sudden divine errands, though scholars remain divided on whether this is metaphorical storytelling or rooted in ritualized domestic care. You trudge beside her, noticing the faint sheen of sweat on the horses' coats, the subtle movement of tails, and the soft echo of brushing against polished stone. By the time she finishes, every stall is immaculate. The horses stand alert but calm, the tack gleams, and the air feels charged with subtle vitality. Fringe myths insist that her careful attention could influence both the strength and temperament of these divine steeds, while historians still debate whether such tales were literal, symbolic, or purely poetic. You trudge alongside her, feeling the gentle pull of drowsy fascination. The rhythm of repeated action and the quiet satisfaction of witnessing diligence transform chaos into harmony. Finally, Hestia steps back, surveying the stables with a faint, serene smile. Fringe accounts insist that calm radiates from her work long after she leaves, and historians still debate whether this is metaphorical or reflects actual ritual observation. You trudge beside her, drowsy, reflective, and subtly enchanted by the hypnotic, methodical rhythm of domestic diligence, magnified to divine scale. You trudge behind Hestia as she ascends to the private gardens of Aphrodite. The air is thick with the scent of roses and myrtle, carried on a faint sea breeze from distant shores. We walk along pathways that wind between marble fountains and delicate flower beds, where every petal glistens with morning dew. It's been said in some old stories that the blossoms would turn slightly toward Hestia as she passed. Whether that's a beautiful metaphor or something people truly believed, we can't be sure. As you step carefully along the stone paths, you feel the soft crunch of gravel under your feet and begin to notice the subtle pull of her steady, hypnotic rhythm. Each garden bed requires her precise attention. Hestia inspects the flowers for any fallen petals, gently tucks stray blooms back into their place, and brushes dust from the leaves. There are fringe legends that claim flowers tended by her would gain an extra layer of fragrance or vibrancy. Scholars still debate if this was meant literally or just a way to embellish the stories. As you trail behind her, you can't help but notice the interplay of colors, the glimmer of dew on the leaves, and the soothing repetition of her hands moving with such deliberate care. It's a quiet, mesmerizing dance of order and beauty. She pauses at a rose bush. A single leaf is caught awkwardly in a bloom, and she carefully plucks it away. She adjusts the branches just so, restoring the perfect symmetry of the petals. Fringe myths insist that the roses themselves seem to respond to her presence, opening more fully or holding their perfect form for longer. Historians remain divided on whether this was a symbolic story or a literal belief. As you continue to trudge along, you find yourself captivated by this gentle cadence, the soft rustle of leaves, and the hypnotic rhythm of meticulous attention in motion. It's almost like a living meditation. Hestia moves along the narrow pathways, arranging flower pots, smoothing the soil around the plants, and tidying away garden tools that were left nearby. Some ancient accounts suggest that even the smallest disruption in this garden could create ripples through its delicate ecosystem. Scholars still argue whether these stories were meant as metaphors for life or as practical gardening advice. You trudge behind her, your senses tuning into the faint hum of insects, the soft shimmer of sunlight on the petals, and the almost imperceptible tranquility that her careful actions seem to create. The entire garden feels like it's breathing in time with her movements. Occasionally, a stray bloom falls to the ground, or a vine twists out of place. Hestia kneels, repositioning it with the gentlest touch you've ever seen. She straightens the stems and brushes away any specks of dust from the leaves. Fringe legends claim that her simple interventions could subtly enhance the growth and beauty of each plant. Historians, of course, still debate whether this was considered a literal power or something purely allegorical. You trudge alongside her, completely entranced by the repetition, the gentle interplay of her focused attention and graceful movement, and the profound sense of calm that is settling over the garden with each touch. Now she pauses at a fountain surrounded by lilies. With a delicate sweep of her hand, she smooths the water's surface and then adjusts a few nearby stones to maintain the perfect symmetry of the arrangement. Fringe tales suggest that the water itself would reflect more brightly under her gaze, though scholars are still divided on whether this is just poetic flourish or a description of ritual belief. You trudge behind her, listening to the faint sound of dripping water blending with the rustle of leaves. Together, they form a meditative, hypnotic backdrop to her work, lulling you into a state of deep calm. By the time she finishes, every single flower bed is perfectly aligned. Every vine is gently guided into place, and the entire garden seems to exude a calm, balanced energy. Fringe myths claim that mortals who glimpsed her work might feel a subtle sense of inspiration or serenity wash over them. Historians still debate whether such tales are symbolic or rooted in actual observations of ancient rituals. You trudge alongside her, now deeply aware of the gentle rhythm of her repeated, careful actions. The interplay of light, scent, and motion, combined with the quiet, lulling power of her attention, has a profound effect on everything and everyone around her. Finally, Hestia steps back, surveying the garden with a faint, serene smile. And in that moment, you realize that even these repetitive, seemingly minor errands petals, smoothing soil, arranging pots carry a quiet, enduring magic. Fringe accounts insist that a sense of calm radiates from her work long after she leaves. Whether this is metaphorical or reflects an actual ritual practice is still debated. As you trudge beside her, you feel drowsy, reflective, and quietly enchanted by the hypnotic, methodical rhythm of domestic diligence magnified here to a divine scale. The simplest acts performed with love and attention hold the greatest power. Thank you for joining me on this journey. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the bell for more explorations into myth and legend. See you next time. Rows of shields, spears, and helmets line the walls, gleaming dully in the soft light that filters through narrow windows. Fringe myths suggest that the weapons themselves could sense her presence, subtly vibrating or realigning when she passed, though historians still argue whether this is literal belief or poetic embellishment. You step carefully, mindful of stray bits of straw or discarded straps, and you notice the hypnotic rhythm of her slow, deliberate pace. Each weapon demands precise attention. Hestia checks straps, smooths leather, and adjusts the positioning of swords and spears so that each rests perfectly in its rack. Fringe legends claim that a weapon carefully tended by Hestia would retain sharpness or strike truer in battle, though scholars still debate whether this was literal belief or symbolic storytelling. You trudge behind her, fascinated by the contrast of domestic care in a chamber devoted to war and the subtle, almost magical precision she exerts over cold, inanimate objects. She pauses at a particularly large shield, tilting it slightly to catch the light and inspecting it for nicks or dust. Fringe myths insist that even the smallest adjustment could influence the courage or temperament of warriors who later wielded it, though historians remain divided on whether this is allegorical or literal. You trudge along, noticing the soft scrape of her fingers over polished surfaces, the faint hum of anticipation in the room, and the hypnotic cadence of repeated, careful motions. Hestia moves along narrow aisles, adjusting helmet plumes, brushing dust from armor plates, and checking the alignment of spears. Fringe accounts suggest that even the tiniest misalignment could disrupt the symbolic order of war readiness, though scholars still debate whether these tales were allegorical or intended as literal guidance. You trudge behind her, captivated by the rhythm of repetitive action, the faint metallic tang in the air, and the subtle sense of control imposed over objects designed for chaos. Occasionally, a weapon rests slightly askew or a strap dangles too loosely. Hestia kneels, straightening it with deliberate precision, smoothing edges, and nudging each item into perfect alignment. Fringe legends claim that these small gestures preserved harmony in the armory, subtly affecting the mood and confidence of warriors. Though historians remain uncertain about the literal truth of such claims, you trudge alongside her, feeling the lulling effect of slow, methodical attention over objects meant for strength and aggression. She pauses at a rack of spears, tilting each slightly and adjusting angles so that they match perfectly. Fringe tales suggest that the alignment of weapons under her care could influence the outcome of skirmishes, though scholars still argue whether this was literal belief or symbolic narrative. You trudge behind her, noticing the faint shimmer of metal in soft light, the rhythmic echo of her robe brushing stone, and the hypnotic, meditative effect of repeated, precise gestures. By the time she finishes, every sword, spear, shield, and helmet gleams, perfectly aligned, and the air seems subtly infused with order. Fringe myths claim that mortals, glimpsing a weapon so tended, might feel a surge of confidence or calm, while historians remain divided on whether such tales are symbolic, ritualistic, or narrative flourishes. You trudge alongside her, observing the quiet authority in her movements, the soft rhythm of repetition, and the calm, meditative power of diligence applied to objects designed for war. Finally, Hestia steps back, surveying the armory with a faint, serene smile. You realize that even these repetitive, seemingly trivial errands polishing, aligning, adjusting carry quiet, enduring influence. Fringe accounts insist that calm and order radiate long after she leaves, while historians still debate whether this is metaphorical or reflects ritual observation. You trudge beside her, drowsy, reflective, and subtly enchanted by the hypnotic, methodical rhythm of domestic diligence applied even to the instruments of conflict. You trudge behind Hestia as she moves to the vast storage halls of Hermes, where parcels, scrolls, and small pouches of mysterious contents fill every shelf and crate. The air smells faintly of leather, parchment, and faint traces of exotic herbs, and a soft draft carries the subtle rustle of papers and tied packages. Fringe myths suggest that some parcels would rearrange themselves to a more logical order when Hestia passed, though historians still argue whether this was literal belief or metaphorical storytelling. You step carefully over narrow aisles, noticing the hypnotic rhythm of her deliberate steps and the faint whisper of cloth and parchment moving under her touch. Each shelf demands precise attention. Hestia straightens stacks of scrolls, nudges misaligned pouches, and carefully checks tied bundles for wear or damage. Fringe legends claim that items tended by Hestia were more likely to reach their intended recipients without delay, though scholars still debate whether this is literal belief or symbolic guidance for domestic diligence. You trudge behind her, absorbed in the subtle harmony she imposes over what would otherwise seem chaotica, testament to quiet patience in action. She pauses at a small crate, gently opening it to inspect its contents, adjusting small parcels so that each fits snugly and neatly. Fringe myths insist that even minor corrections here could prevent miscommunication or loss among mortals or gods, though historians remain divided on whether this is allegorical or literal. You trudge along, noticing the soft scrape of paper, the faint creak of crates, and the rhythmic swish of her robes blending into a meditative cadence. Hestia moves down long aisles, inspecting labels, ensuring that tied cords are neither too loose nor too tight, and brushing dust from the edges of packages. Fringe accounts suggest that Hermes himself sometimes left small notes or charms in parcels to reward her meticulous attention, though scholars still argue whether these tales were literal or narrative embellishment. You trudge beside her, noting how each subtle adjustment to tilt here, a nudge there, contributes to the overall sense of order and calm in a hall filled with potential chaos. Occasionally, a bundle slips slightly from a shelf. Hestia kneels gracefully, repositioning it and realigning surrounding parcels to maintain symmetry. Fringe legends claim that parcels so arranged would somehow travel more smoothly along Hermes's routes, though historians still debate whether this is metaphorical storytelling or ritual belief. You trudge behind her, mesmerized by the hypnotic repetition, the soft smells of herbs and parchment, and the gentle rhythm of meticulous, deliberate action. She pauses to inspect a particularly fragile bundle, carefully adjusting the padding and smoothing rough edges. Fringe tales suggest that the integrity of messages or gifts could be subtly preserved under her attention, though scholars remain divided on whether this is literal belief or allegorical. You trudge along, noting the interplay of light filtering through high windows, the muted colors of tied parchment, and the hypnotic cadence of repeated care. By the time she finishes the final row, every parcel, scroll, and pouch is neat, aligned, and ready for dispatch. Fringe myths insist that those receiving items from this storage hall might notice smoother travel or more reliable deliveries, while historians still debate whether such stories are symbolic, ritual, or literal belief. You trudge alongside her, noticing the gentle rhythm of repetition, the subtle balance imposed upon apparent chaos, and the quiet sense of calm that seems to linger in the hall. Finally, Hestia steps back, surveying her work with a faint serene smile. You realize that even these repetitive, seemingly minor errand straightening, adjusting, inspecting carry quiet, enduring influence. Fringe accounts claim that the calm and order she leaves radiate long after she departs. While historians still debate whether this is metaphorical or reflects actual ritual observation, you trudge beside her, drowsy, reflective, and quietly enchanted by the hypnotic, methodical rhythm of domestic diligence applied to a hall overflowing with potential disorder. You trudge behind Hestia as she heads toward the celestial kitchens reserved for the preparation of nectar and ambrosia, a cool, softly lit chamber where the faintly sweet scent of honey and the subtle tempts of divine herbs mingle in the air. The counters are lined with golden vessels, jars of exotic ingredients, and tiny polished ladles that glint in the light. Fringe myths suggest that the containers themselves would subtly shift or tilt into neat alignment when she passed, though historians still argue whether this was literal belief or symbolic storytelling. You step carefully, mindful of the delicate glass and metal, while the rhythmic swish of her robes begins to lull you into a near trance. Each vessel demands precise attention. Hestia carefully adjusts lids, aligns jars by size and content, and checks that the precious nectar glimmers without disturbance. Fringe legends claim that nectar tended by Hestia retained its purity longer, though scholars still debate whether this was intended literally or allegorically. You trudge behind her, noticing the faint hum of quiet activity, the subtle interplay of light on golden vessels, and the hypnotic cadence of her slow, deliberate motions. She pauses at a small bowl of ambrosia, tilting it slightly to ensure it sits evenly in its dish and brushing away a speck of dust with her fingertip. Fringe myths insist that even minor corrections could influence the taste and potency of the divine food, though historians remain divided on whether this notion was literal or metaphorical. You trudge along, captivated by the gentle rhythm, the soft clink of glass and metal, and the delicate aroma of sweet ingredients mingling in the air. Hestia moves along the counters, straightening ladles, polishing tiny bowls, and adjusting the alignment of jars so that each reflects symmetry. Fringe accounts suggest that a misaligned vessel could subtly alter the mood of gods consuming it, though scholars still debate whether these stories were allegorical or literal. You trudge behind her, absorbed in the hypnotic repetition of careful motion. The gentle sway of robes and the quiet reassurance of meticulous order imposed upon potentially chaotic substances. Occasionally, a drop of honey has dripped onto a counter. Hestia kneels, wiping it away with precise, measured gestures and realigning the surrounding vessels. Fringe legends claim that these minor interventions preserved the harmony of ambrosial preparation, though historians still argue whether this is symbolic storytelling or ritualized belief. You trudge alongside her, noticing how even repetitive, seemingly boring tasks, adjusting a jar, wiping a counter, tilting a bowl carry a quiet, soothing power when executed with steady care. She pauses at a shelf of jars filled with exotic herbs, brushing dust from lids, ensuring labels are facing forward, and aligning containers so that the light glances off them evenly. Fringe tales suggest that her presence could subtly enhance the aroma or potency of herbs, though scholars remain divided on whether this was literal belief or narrative embellishment. You trudge behind her, captivated by the faint scent, the glimmer of polished surfaces, and the hypnotic rhythm of repeated, careful attention. By the time she finishes, every vessel gleams, every container is aligned, and the air feels infused with a subtle, sweet harmony. Fringe myths insist that mortals glimpsing nectar so tended might experience unexpected clarity or calm, while historians still debate whether such tales are allegorical, ritualistic, or literal. You trudge alongside her, absorbing the gentle rhythm of repetition, the interplay of scent, light, and motion, and the quiet sense of satisfaction in witnessing diligence transform potential chaos into harmony. Finally, Hestia steps back, surveying the celestial kitchens with a faint, serene smile. You realize that even these repetitive, seemingly minor errands polishing, adjusting, aligning carry, quiet, enduring influence, fringe accounts insist that calm radiates from her work long after she leaves, and historians still debate whether this is symbolic or reflects ritual observation. You trudge beside her, drowsy, reflective, and subtly enchanted by the hypnotic, methodical rhythm of domestic diligence magnified to divine scale. You trudge behind Hestia as she makes her way to the celestial laundry rooms, a cool, quiet chamber filled with piles of folded robes, freshly laundered linens, and stacks of gleaming towels. The faint scent of olive oil, soap, and sun-warmed fabric fills the air, a strangely comforting combination that seems to settle around you. Fringe myths suggest that garments themselves would straighten or smooth slightly when she passed, though historians still argue whether this was literal belief or symbolic storytelling. You step carefully along narrow pathways, the soft swish of her robes and the gentle hum of freshly pressed fabric creating a hypnotic cadence. Each pile of linens demands precise attention. Hestia lifts a neatly folded robe, brushing away a faint speck of dust, and adjusts the stacks so that corners align perfectly. Fringe legends claim that robes tended by Hestia retained a subtle aura of warmth and order, though scholars still debate whether this was literal belief or allegorical. You trudge behind her, noticing the rhythmic sound of fabric sliding across tables, the faint creak of stacked linens, and the quiet hypnotic rhythm of her slow, meticulous movements. She pauses at a particularly delicate robe, smoothing wrinkles and adjusting folds with gentle, deliberate motions. Fringe myths insist that garments handled this carefully would be more comfortable, perhaps even subtly protective, though historians remain divided on whether this notion was taken literally or was a symbolic flourish. You trudge along, captivated by the subtle, meditative cadence of her hands, the quiet swish of fabric, and the almost magical effect of careful attention applied to simple, everyday objects. Hestia moves along rows of tables, inspecting towels, sheets, and ceremonial garments, adjusting and aligning each pile so that they form harmonious patterns. Fringe accounts suggest that even minor misalignments could disrupt the flow of daily rituals, though scholars still argue whether these stories were metaphorical or literal. You trudge behind her, noticing the interplay of sunlight filtering through high windows, the faint scent of soap, and the hypnotic repetition of folds being adjusted and edges straightened. Occasionally, a robe slips or a towel leans awkwardly. Hestia kneels to restore order, repositioning the fabric, smoothing wrinkles, and ensuring every piece is aligned. Fringe legends claim that her subtle interventions radiated calm to those wearing the garments, though historians remain uncertain whether this was intended literally or as poetic metaphor. You trudge alongside her, mesmerized by the gentle repetition, the quiet rhythm of attention, and the soft, tactile pleasure of watching meticulous care applied to cloth. She pauses to inspect a stack of ceremonial robes, brushing dust from golden embroidery, straightening hems, and adjusting folds so the garments gleam in perfect symmetry. Fringe tales suggest that her work might even influence the aura or mood of gods wearing these robes, though scholars still debate whether this is allegorical storytelling or literal belief. You trudge behind her, noticing the faint glimmer of threads, the soft rustle of fabric under her fingertips, and the hypnotic cadence of deliberate, repeated motion. By the time she finishes, every robe, towel, and sheet is perfectly folded, aligned, and gleaming with care. Fringe myths claim that mortals glimpsing garments so tended might feel subtle, calm, or order in their own homes, while historians still debate whether these tales are symbolic, ritualistic, or literal. You trudge alongside her, absorbing the soft rhythm of repetition, the interplay of scent, light, and motion, and the quiet satisfaction of witnessing diligence transform ordinary cloth into objects of serene order. Finally, Hestia steps back, surveying the laundry rooms with a faint, serene smile. You realize that even repetitive, seemingly trivial errands folding, smoothing, aligning carry, quiet, enduring influence, fringe accounts insist that calm radiates from her work long after she leaves, and historians still debate whether this is metaphorical or reflects actual ritual observation. You trudge beside her, drowsy, reflective, and quietly enchanted by the hypnotic, methodical rhythm of domestic diligence magnified to divine scale. You trudge behind Hestia as she makes her way to the celestial archives. The chamber is hushed and cavernous, filled with tablets, scrolls, and bundles of papyrus stacked on towering shelves that seem to vanish into the darkness above. The faint smell of aged ink, cold stone, and waxed parchment hangs in the air, mingling with a soft draft that carries the whisper of secrets long forgotten. There are fringe myths, stories told on the edges of belief that say the texts themselves subtly shift into neat rows as she passes, as if recognizing her presence. Historians, of course, still argue whether this was a literal belief or just a metaphorical way of describing her powerful aura of order. You step carefully, mindful of the fragile bundles underfoot, and notice the hypnotic rhythm of her slow, deliberate steps echoing softly in the great stone hall. The sound is a gentle, steady beat in the profound silence. Each tablet and scroll here demands precise attention, a level of care most would find exhausting. But for Hestia, it is a form of meditation. She lifts a carefully tied bundle, her movements unhurried. With a soft brush, she clears away a fine layer of dust, then adjusts the alignment so that the corners meet perfectly. It's a small, almost insignificant action, yet she performs it with total focus. Fringe legends claim that documents tended by Hestia were less likely to be lost or damaged over time. Scholars debate whether this was a literal belief in her divine protection or simply symbolic guidance, a way to teach others the importance of ritualized care for knowledge. You trudge behind her, your senses filled by the soft scrape of parchment, the faint glimmer of light on polished clay tablets, and the quiet, meditative rhythm of her repeated, deliberate actions. It's a slow, enchanting dance of maintenance. She pauses at a particularly ancient scroll, its edges frayed with time. With infinite gentleness, she smooths them out, her fingers tracing the delicate fibers. She inspects the ink, her gaze sharp, looking for any signs of fading or smudges that might obscure the words within. Fringe myths insist that even these minor corrections, this patient tending, could preserve the clarity of the wisdom contained in the text. Historians remain divided on whether this notion was meant literally or was a poetic metaphor for the act of preserving intellectual traditions. You trudge alongside her, mesmerized by the soft swish of her robes against the stone floor, the faint returning echo of her steps, and the gentle, constant rhythm of meticulous attention. Restoring order in this chamber so dense with accumulated knowledge, Hestia moves along the narrow aisles, her presence a quiet force of organization. She straightens bundles that have shifted, adjusts the small labels tied to each one, and gently nudges towering stacks so that they form harmonious, pleasing patterns. Fringe accounts suggest that misaligned documents could subtly confuse mortal or divine readers, leading their thoughts astray. Scholars, naturally, still argue whether these stories were allegorical warnings about intellectual sloppiness or literal beliefs about the magical properties of order. You trudge behind her, noticing the beautiful interplay of sunlight streaming through high, unseen windows. Dust motes dance in the golden beams, illuminated for a moment before disappearing again. You watch the hypnotic repetition of her careful, deliberate gestures, each one a small act of devotion to the knowledge housed here. Occasionally, a scroll or tablet leans slightly out of place, a tiny disruption in the grand scheme of the archives. Hestia kneels to restore its balance. Her hands move with practiced precision, nudging edges, smoothing rolled parchment that has begun to uncurl, and aligning the surrounding objects to create a sense of visual harmony. Fringe legends claim that her careful attention radiated an aura of calm, an order that spread throughout the entire archives, pacifying the chaotic nature of raw information. Historians remain uncertain whether this was a literal belief in her divine power or simply a poetic embellishment. a story to illustrate the calming effect of a well-ordered environment. You trudge along, entranced by the quiet rhythm of her work, the soft, dry scent of aged paper, and the meditative cadence of her repeated, patient care. She pauses now at a large bundle of papyrus, its surface gray with the dust of ages. She brushes it clean, her hand moving in a slow, sweeping motion. She aligns the brittle edges, making sure they are protected, and then checks the ties, ensuring they are neither too tight to damage the fragile material nor too loose to hold it securely. Fringe tales suggest that her touch, her very presence, could subtly preserve the legibility of even the most ancient and faded texts. Again, scholars debate whether this is a metaphor for dedicated scholarship or a literal account of her divine influence. You trudge behind her, your awareness filled by the gentle interplay of light and shadow, scent and motion. You feel the hypnotic, almost soporific effect of her steady, deliberate work, a quiet symphony of care that seems to slow time itself. By the time she finishes, the archives have been transformed. Every scroll, every tablet, every bundle is perfectly aligned, dusted, and ordered. The room feels different, calmer, as if it can breathe again. Fringe myths claim that those who handled these texts afterward might find the reading smoother, their comprehension clearer, as if her touch had smoothed the path to understanding. You trudge alongside her, your own mind absorbing the quiet rhythm of her repeated, careful action. You feel the sense of harmony she has imposed upon the seeming chaos, and the subtle, soothing pull of patience applied to knowledge preserved across countless centuries. It feels profound, as if you've witnessed something sacred. Finally, Hestia steps back, her work complete. She surveys the ordered archives with a faint, serene smile of satisfaction. In that moment, you realize that even these repetitive, seemingly trivial errands dusting, aligning, adjusting carry a quiet, enduring influence. They are not grand acts, but they are essential. Fringe accounts insist that a palpable calm radiates from her work long after she leaves, a lingering blessing on the space. Historians continue to debate whether this is a metaphor for the lasting impact of diligence or a reflection of ritual observation. As you trudge beside her toward the exit, you feel drowsy, reflective, and quietly enchanted. You have been captivated by the hypnotic, methodical rhythm of simple domestic diligence, magnified to a divine scale. You understand now that the preservation of what we hold dear is not a single heroic act, but a slow, steady, and unending practice of care. Thank you for watching. If this story resonated with you, consider subscribing for more journeys into myth and meaning. You trudge behind Hestia as she approaches the celestial music rooms. It's a spacious chamber, alive with potential. Lyres, flutes, and drums fill the space, and you can feel a faint hum in the air, as if the strings on the harps are vibrating even when untouched. The air smells wonderful like polished wood, resin, and the faint sweet scent of wax. A soft glow from enchanted sconces on the walls illuminates each instrument, making them gleam with an inner light. There are old myths, fringe legends that say some instruments would subtly adjust their tuning or even their angle when Hestia passed by, as if they were recognizing her presence, paying her respect. Historians still argue about that was it, a literal belief, or just a beautiful poetic metaphor. You step carefully, trying not to disturb the delicate balance between strings and wood. The hypnotic swish of Hestia's robes as she walks ahead of you begins to draw your mind into a gentle, peaceful trance. Every single instrument in this room demands meticulous attention, and Hestia gives it freely. She lightly plucks a string on a lyre, her head tilted, listening. She adjusts its tension with a minute twist of a peg. She straightens a drum to ensure it sits in perfect alignment. Fringe legends claim that instruments tended by Hestia produced a sound that was subtly more harmonious, more pure. Of course, scholars are still debating whether that's a literal fact or just symbolic storytelling. You trudge along behind her, noticing the soft resonance that lingers in the air, even after her fingers move away. You become aware of the quiet, meditative rhythm of her repeated, deliberate gestures. It's calming, almost mesmerizing. She pauses at a row of flutes, each one resting in its holder. She tilts them slightly, one by one, dusting away faint smudges you can barely see. She ensures each rests perfectly, securely. The old myths insist that even these minor adjustments could influence the clarity of the music played on them. whether by gods or mortals. Historians remain divided on whether this idea was meant to be literal or metaphorical. A lesson in the importance of small details. You trudge along, completely captivated by the delicate harmony of what you're seeing, hearing, and feeling. The faint scent of wood resin mixes with soft notes that seem almost alive, hanging in the air around you. Hestia moves gracefully across the room. She adjusts drumheads, polishes the warm wood of a cello, and straightens the strings on a kithara. She aligns the instruments so that each one forms a visually pleasing pattern, a kind of functional, beautiful order. Fringe accounts from ancient times suggest that misaligned instruments could subtly distort divine music, creating a dissonance no one could quite place. Scholars still argue whether these tales were symbolic warnings, instructional lessons, or literal beliefs. You just trudge behind her, absorbed in the hypnotic repetition, the gentle interplay of texture, sound, and light, and the subtle sense of calm that's growing stronger with each of her precise, careful motions. Every now and then, she finds a small imperfection. A string is slightly slack, or a drum rests unevenly on its stand. Hestia kneels, her focus absolute. She tunes, she straightens, she nudges each object into harmony. Her movements are so fluid and deliberate that they almost seem choreographed, like a slow, graceful dance. Fringe legends claim that her careful attention didn't just harmonize the instruments themselves, but also the minds of those who would later play them. Historians, as always, remain uncertain whether this was a literal belief or just a poetic embellishment to honor her. You trudge along, noticing the soft collective hum of properly aligned strings, the faint shimmer of light on polished wood, and the meditative cadence of her repeated, meticulous work. It's deeply soothing to watch. She pauses at a lyre, decorated with intricate mother-of-pearl inlays. She gently brushes dust from the fretboard that you didn't even see was there. She aligns the tuning pegs so they form a perfect straight line and then smooths the strings with the side of her hand. The old tales suggest that music performed on instruments Hestia attended to was subtly more pleasing, more resonant, more beautiful to the ear. Scholars still debate whether this is literal truth, an allegory for something else, or just a good narrative flourish. You trudge behind her, mesmerized by the subtle precision of her work. The quiet interplay of sound and light in the room, and the hypnotic rhythm of careful attention shaping a space filled with so much creative energy. By the time she finishes, the entire room is transformed. Every lyre, flute, drum, and harp gleams under the soft light. Each one is perfectly aligned, subtly tuned, and ready. The fringe myths claim that when mortals hear music played on these instruments, they might sense a faint, unexplainable harmony, a feeling of deep calm. Historians are still debating whether such tales are symbolic, part of a ritual, or meant to be taken literally. You trudge alongside her now as she moves towards the exit, absorbing the gentle rhythm of her repeated, precise actions. The interplay of scent, sight, and sound has settled into a quiet symphony. There's a deep satisfaction in witnessing how her diligence has transformed potential chaos into serene, perfect order. Finally, Hestia steps back, just at the threshold of the door. She surveys the music room with a faint, serene smile. It's a look of quiet contentment. And in that moment, you realize that even these repetitive, seemingly trivial errands polishing, aligning, tuning carry a quiet, enduring influence. The old accounts insist that a feeling of calm and harmony radiates from this room long after she leaves. And while historians will forever debate whether that's a metaphor or a reflection of ritual observation, you feel it. You trudge beside her, feeling drowsy, reflective, and quietly enchanted by the hypnotic, methodical rhythm of simple domestic diligence, magnified to a divine and beautiful scale. It's a reminder that true power isn't always loud. Sometimes it's in the quiet, consistent care for the world around us. Thanks for joining this journey today. Don't forget to like and subscribe for more stories. You trudge behind Hestia as she makes her way to the vast bathhouses of Olympus, a cavernous space filled with pools of steaming water, fountains trickling gently, and soft mist that clings to your skin like a cool whisper. The air smells faintly of herbs, mineral-rich water, and polished stone, mingling into a strangely soothing fragrance. Fringe myths suggest that the pools themselves might ripple subtly in her presence, though historians still argue whether this is literal belief or symbolic storytelling. You step carefully on slightly wet floors, listening to the echo of dripping water. while the soft rhythm of her robe's brushing stone begins to lull your thoughts into drowsy calm. Each bath and basin demands meticulous attention. Hestia checks water levels, adjusts temperature with subtle divine intuition, and ensures that towels, oils, and brushes are neatly aligned. Fringe legends claim that pools tended by Hestia maintained clarity and a subtle restorative effect, though scholars still debate whether this was literal belief or poetic metaphor. You trudge behind her, noticing the soft shimmer of light on water surfaces, the gentle plink of droplets, and the hypnotic cadence of her deliberate, careful movements. She pauses at a central pool, smoothing ripples with a delicate sweep of her hand, brushing away a stray leaf or petal, and adjusting floating garlands so that symmetry is restored. Fringe myths insist that minor corrections here could enhance relaxation for divine bathers, though historians remain divided on whether this notion was literal or allegorical. You trudge along, captivated by the gentle rhythm, the interplay of scent, water, and light, and the subtle, almost soporific effect of repeated, careful attention. Hestia moves across the bathhouse, aligning towels, polishing bronze faucets, and adjusting seating areas so that everything exudes harmony. Fringe accounts suggest that even the smallest disorder could disturb the tranquil flow of baths, though scholars still argue whether these stories were literal or symbolic. You trudge behind her, absorbed in the hypnotic repetition, the soft rustle of robes, and the quiet reassurance of meticulous care in a space dedicated to relaxation. Occasionally, a floating flower drifts out of place, or a towel slumps unevenly. Hestia kneels gracefully, repositioning items, smoothing fabric, and ensuring symmetry in every corner. Fringe legends claim that her attention could subtly influence moods and temperaments, though historians remain uncertain whether this was intended literally or poetic metaphor. You trudge alongside her, entranced by the gentle meditative rhythm of repeated motion, the soft glimmer of water, and the calming scent that lingers in the air. She pauses at a smaller pool with aromatic oils, swirling the surface lightly to distribute fragrance and adjusting small bowls of salts and herbs with precise care. Fringe tales suggest that Hestia's interventions enhanced both the restorative and aesthetic qualities of the bath, though scholars still debate whether this was literal belief or symbolic embellishment. You trudge behind her, noticing the faint shimmer of sunlight on rippling water, the subtle scent of herbs, and the quiet cadence of deliberate, repeated actions. By the time she finishes, every pool gleams, every towel and tool is perfectly aligned, and the bathhouse exudes a calm, balanced energy. Fringe myths claim that visitors bathing in these waters might sense subtle relaxation or clarity, while historians still debate whether such tales are symbolic, ritualistic, or literal. You trudge alongside her, absorbing the gentle rhythm of repeated attention, the interplay of light, scent, and motion, and the quiet satisfaction of witnessing diligence transform potential disorder into serene order. Finally, Hestia steps back, surveying the bathhouse with a faint, serene smile. You realize that even repetitive, seemingly trivial errand smoothing water, adjusting towels, aligning tools, carry quiet, enduring influence. Fringe accounts insist that calm radiates from her work long after she leaves, while historians still debate whether this is metaphorical or reflects ritual observation. You trudge beside her, drowsy, reflective, and quietly enchanted by the hypnotic, methodical rhythm of domestic diligence magnified to divine scale. You trudge behind Hestia as she moves toward the hall of ceremonial offerings, a grand chamber lined with golden altars, crystal vessels, and trays of carefully arranged fruits, grains, and small tokens of devotion. The air smells faintly of honey, incense, and polished marble, mingling into a subtle sweetness that almost makes you yawn. Fringe myths suggest that some offerings might realign themselves slightly when she passed, though historians still argue whether this was literal belief or metaphorical storytelling. You step carefully, listening to the faint echo of footsteps and the hypnotic swish of her robes as she moves with measured patience. Each altar demands precise attention. Hestia lifts a crystal bowl, brushing away a tiny speck of dust, and adjusts its position so that symmetry is perfect. Fringe legends claim that offerings tended by Hestia retains divine favor longer, though scholars still debate whether this was literal belief or symbolic embellishment. You trudge behind her, noticing the glimmer of polished surfaces, the gentle sway of her robes, and the quiet, meditative rhythm of her repeated, careful actions. She pauses at a particularly ornate altar, rearranging trays of fruit and small jars so that the patterns of color and shape are harmonious. Fringe myths insist that minor adjustments could subtly influence the reception of offerings by the gods, though historians remain divided on whether this notion was literal or allegorical. You trudge along, captivated by the interplay of light, scent, and motion. The subtle shimmer of gold against marble and the hypnotic cadence of repeated gestures. Hestia moves down the long chamber, straightening garlands, smoothing grains in trays, and nudging vessels so that each aligns perfectly. Fringe accounts suggest that even a tiny misalignment could disrupt the symbolic flow of divine attention. Though scholars still debate whether these stories were symbolic or literal, you trudge behind her, absorbed in the quiet rhythm, the gentle click of vessels, and the soothing repetition of deliberate, methodical care. Occasionally, a small offering tilts or a garland sags slightly. Hestia kneels gracefully, adjusting, smoothing, and nudging items into perfect order. Fringe legends claim that her subtle interventions radiated calm and balance, though historians remain uncertain whether this was literal belief or poetic metaphor. You trudge alongside her, noticing the gentle repetition, the quiet interplay of scent, light, and touch, and the meditative cadence that gradually lulls your mind toward drowsiness. She pauses at a row of crystal vessels, polishing each with a delicate sweep of her hand and adjusting their positions for symmetry. Fringe tales suggest that offerings so tended were more likely to be favorably received, though scholars still debate whether this is literal, allegorical, or narrative flourish. You trudge behind her, mesmerized by the soft clink of glass, the shimmering reflection of light, and the hypnotic rhythm of repeated, precise motion. By the time she finishes, every altar glimmers. Every offering is perfectly arranged, and the chamber radiates subtle harmony. Fringe myths claim that mortals glimpsing offerings so tended might experience a faint sense of blessing or calm. While historians still debate whether such tales are symbolic, ritualistic, or literal, you trudge alongside her, absorbing the gentle rhythm of repeated attention, the interplay of scent, sight, and motion, and the quiet satisfaction of witnessing diligence transform potential disorder into serene order. Finally, Hestia steps back, surveying the hall of ceremonial offerings with a faint, serene smile. You realize that even repetitive, seemingly trivial, errands polishing, arranging, aligning carry quiet, enduring influence. Fringe accounts insist that calm radiates from her work long after she leaves, while historians still debate whether this is metaphorical or reflects ritual observation. You trudge beside her, drowsy, reflective, and quietly enchanted by the hypnotic, methodical rhythm of domestic diligence magnified to divine scale. You trudge behind Hestia as she ascends to the Hall of Thrones, where the seats of gods sit in polished majesty, each carved with intricate patterns and soft cushions that gleam like molten gold in the muted sunlight. The air carries the faint scent of polished wood, beeswax, and distant incense, mingling into a quiet serenity that almost makes your eyelids droop. Fringe myths suggest that the thrones themselves might subtly straighten or adjust cushions when Hestia passed, though historians still argue whether this was literal belief or symbolic storytelling. You step carefully on the marble floor, the soft echo of her robes brushing stone, forming a hypnotic rhythm that seems to slow time itself. Each throne demands precise attention. Hestia smooths cushions, adjusts armrests, and checks the alignment of carved decorations so that symmetry and order are perfect. Fringe legends claim that thrones tended by Hestia maintained their authority and dignity, though scholars still debate whether this was literal belief or allegorical guidance. You trudge behind her, noticing the faint shimmer of polished wood, the soft rustle of her robes, and the meditative rhythm of repeated, deliberate gestures. She pauses at Zeus's massive throne, brushing away a faint layer of dust, adjusting the angle of the cushion, and ensuring that the carved symbols are perfectly aligned. Fringe myths insist that even minor corrections here could influence the majesty or gravitas perceived by both gods and mortals, though historians remain divided on whether this notion was literal or metaphorical. You trudge along, mesmerized by the subtle interplay of light, scent, and movement, the hypnotic cadence of her meticulous attention gently lulling your mind. Hestia moves from throne to throne, straightening drapery, polishing surfaces, and adjusting cushions so that each seat radiates calm dignity. Fringe accounts suggest that even a slightly skewed throne could symbolically undermine authority, though scholars still debate whether these stories were intended literally or as symbolic narrative. You trudge behind her, absorbed in the soft rhythm of repeated, careful attention. The interplay of tactile, visual, and olfactory cues creating a quiet sense of serenity. Occasionally, a cushion tilts or an armrest shifts. Hestia kneels gracefully, realigning, smoothing, and nudging items into perfect order. Fringe legends claim that her subtle interventions radiated calm and balance throughout the hall, though historians remain uncertain whether this was literal belief or poetic metaphor. You trudge alongside her, noticing the gentle repetition, the quiet echo of marble, and the meditative cadence of deliberate, methodical care. She pauses at Hera's throne, brushing polished wood and adjusting cushions with precise fluid gestures. Fringe tales suggest that her careful attention could subtly influence the perceived authority or comfort of the gods seated there, though scholars still debate whether this is literal, allegorical, or purely narrative. You trudge behind her, captivated by the soft swish of robes, the faint glimmer of light on carved surfaces, and the hypnotic rhythm of repeated, precise motion. By the time she finishes, every throne gleams, every cushion is perfectly aligned, and the hall radiates subtle authority and calm. Fringe myths claim that mortals or visiting deities experiencing these thrones might sense enhanced dignity or balance, while historians still debate whether such tales are symbolic, ritualistic, or literal. You trudge alongside her, absorbing the gentle rhythm of repeated attention, the interplay of sight, scent, and motion, and the quiet satisfaction of witnessing diligence transform potential disorder into serene order. Finally, Hestia steps back, surveying the Hall of Thrones with a faint, serene smile. You realize that even repetitive, seemingly trivial errands adjusting cushions, polishing surfaces, aligning items carry quiet, enduring influence. Fringe accounts insist that calm radiates from her work long after she leaves, while historians still debate whether this is metaphorical or reflects ritual observation. You trudge beside her, drowsy, reflective, and quietly enchanted by the hypnotic, methodical rhythm of domestic diligence magnified to divine scale. You trudge behind Hestia as she moves toward the celestial corridors that connect the halls of Olympus, a series of long, echoing passageways lined with polished marble, tapestries, and faintly glowing sconces. The air carries the soft scent of stone warmed by sunlight, mingling with distant floral aromas drifting from the gardens, creating a strangely soothing atmosphere. Fringe myths suggest that the corridors themselves might subtly straighten or adjust carpets and drapes in her presence, though historians still argue whether this was literal belief or symbolic storytelling. You step carefully, the hypnotic echo of her robes brushing the floor forming a gentle cadence that seems to slow your thoughts and quiet your mind. Each section of corridor demands attention to detail. Hestia straightens rugs, adjusts the angles of hanging tapestries, and brushes dust from carved moldings, so that symmetry and order are maintained. Fringe legends claim that corridors tended by Hestia facilitated smoother divine movement and subtly influenced the moods of travelers, though scholars still debate whether this was literal belief or allegorical narrative. You trudge behind her, noticing the interplay of soft light on polished surfaces, the faint rustle of fabric, and the meditative rhythm of her repeated, deliberate gestures. She pauses at a particularly long stretch of carpet, smoothing wrinkles, adjusting edges, and nudging decorative elements into perfect alignment. Fringe myths insist that even minor corrections here could enhance the grace and safety of passage for gods and mortals alike, though historians remain divided on whether this notion was literal or metaphorical. You trudge along, captivated by the gentle cadence, the subtle interplay of color and texture, and the hypnotic repetition of her careful attention. Hestia moves along the corridors, aligning sconces, straightening drapes, and ensuring that light and shadow fall harmoniously. Fringe accounts suggest that misaligned decorative elements could disrupt the symbolic flow of movement, though scholars still argue whether these stories were literal or symbolic. You trudge behind her, absorbed in the quiet rhythm of repeated action, the soft echo of footsteps, and the soothing, almost soporific effect of methodical care over architectural details. Occasionally, a tapestry hangs slightly askew or a rug edge curls. Hestia kneels, gracefully adjusting fabric, straightening decorations, and restoring order with precise, fluid movements. Fringe legends claim that her subtle interventions radiated calm and balance through the corridors, though historians remain uncertain whether this was literal belief or poetic embellishment. You trudge alongside her, noticing the hypnotic cadence, the interplay of light and shadow, and the meditative repetition of her actions. She pauses at a corner where sunlight spills unevenly across the marble floor, nudging a small decorative vase to catch the light evenly and smoothing a rug to enhance symmetry. Fringe tales suggest that her attention subtly enhanced the experience of passage, making movement through the corridors smoother and more aesthetically harmonious. Though scholars still debate whether this is literal, symbolic, or narrative flourish. You trudge behind her, noticing the faint glimmer of marble, the soft swish of robes, and the soothing rhythm of repeated, meticulous care. By the time she finishes, every rug is aligned, every tapestry straight, and every corridor exudes quiet order and subtle grace. Fringe myths claim that mortals or gods traveling these halls might sense a faint calm or harmony, while historians still debate whether such tales are symbolic, ritualistic, or literal. You trudge alongside her, absorbing the gentle rhythm of repeated attention. The interplay of sight, texture, and scent, and the quiet satisfaction of witnessing diligence transform potential disorder into serene order. Finally, Hestia steps back, surveying the celestial corridors with a faint, serene smile. You realize that even repetitive, seemingly trivial errand smoothing rugs, straightening tapestries, adjusting vases carry quiet, enduring influence. Fringe accounts insist that calm radiates from her work long after she leaves, while historians still debate whether this is metaphorical or reflects ritual observation. You trudge beside her, drowsy, reflective, and quietly enchanted by the hypnotic, methodical rhythm of domestic diligence magnified to divine scale. You trudge behind Hestia as she makes her way to the celestial libraries, a quieter, more secluded wing of Olympus, lined with shelves that reach impossibly high, filled with scrolls, tablets, and bound codices. The air smells faintly of parchment, wax, and polished wood, and a soft, dusty light filters through stained glass windows, casting muted patterns across the floor. Fringe myths suggest that the books themselves might shift slightly toward alignment in her presence, as if aware of her careful attention, though historians still argue whether this was literal belief or symbolic storytelling. You step carefully along narrow aisles, the soft swish of her robes creating a rhythmic echo that seems to lull your senses into calm. Each scroll and tome demands precise attention. Hestia carefully lifts bundles, brushes off dust, and adjusts the orientation of stacked texts so that symmetry and order are perfect. Fringe legends claim that documents tended by Hestia preserved knowledge more effectively, though scholars still debate whether this was literal belief or allegorical. You trudge behind her, noticing the faint glimmer of gilded edges, the soft scrape of parchment under her fingers, and the meditative cadence of repeated, deliberate motions. She pauses at a particularly ancient scroll, inspecting it for cracks or fading ink, smoothing curled edges, and adjusting its place on the shelf. Fringe myths insist that even minor adjustments could subtly influence the longevity and clarity of sacred knowledge, though historians remain divided on whether this notion was literal or metaphorical. You trudge along, captivated by the interplay of light, texture, and movement, the quiet rhythm of her attention forming a gentle, hypnotic pattern. Hestia moves along aisles of codices and tablets, straightening bundles, adjusting labels, and nudging stacks so that they form orderly, harmonious patterns. Fringe accounts suggest that even slight disorder could symbolically obscure knowledge, though scholars still debate whether these stories were instructional, metaphorical, or literal. You trudge behind her, absorbed in the hypnotic repetition, the faint rustle of pages, and the soothing interplay of scent, sight, and tactile motion. Occasionally, a scroll leans or a bundle shifts slightly. Hestia kneels gracefully, adjusting, smoothing, and realigning the texts to maintain perfect order. Fringe legends claim that her careful interventions radiated subtle calm and clarity throughout the library, though historians remain uncertain whether this was literal belief or poetic metaphor. You trudge alongside her, mesmerized by the rhythmic gestures, the soft glow of light on parchment, and the meditative cadence of repeated, meticulous care. She pauses at a set of bound codices, brushing dust from gilded spines, straightening edges, and ensuring that labels faced forward for clarity. Fringe tales suggest that knowledge preserved under her attention was more easily understood or retained, though scholars still debate whether this is literal, allegorical, or narrative flourish. You trudge behind her, noticing the interplay of muted color, soft scent, and gentle sounds, and the hypnotic soporific effect of methodical attention applied to the preservation of knowledge. By the time she finishes, every scroll, tablet, and codex is perfectly aligned, dusted, and orderly, and the library radiates subtle, calm, and focus. Fringe myths claim that mortals consulting these texts might notice increased clarity or comprehension. While historians still debate whether such tales are symbolic, ritualistic, or literal, you trudge alongside her, absorbing the gentle rhythm of repeated attention. The quiet interplay of sight, scent, and touch, and the satisfaction of witnessing diligence transform potential disorder into serene order. Finally, Hestia steps back, surveying the celestial libraries with a faint, serene smile. You realize that even repetitive, seemingly trivial errands do sting: aligning, adjusting carry, quiet, enduring influence. Fringe accounts insist that calm and clarity radiate from her work long after she leaves. While historians still debate whether this is metaphorical or reflects ritual observation, you trudge beside her, drowsy, reflective, and quietly enchanted by the hypnotic, methodical rhythm of domestic diligence magnified to divine scale. You trudge behind Hestia as she approaches the observatory of Olympus, a circular chamber crowned with a domed ceiling of polished bronze and dotted with crystal lenses that reflect starlight even in daylight. The faint scent of oiled metal, parchment charts, and a whisper of night-blooming flowers drifts through the air. Fringe myths suggest that the instruments themselves might subtly realign to optimal angles in her presence, though historians still argue whether this was literal belief or symbolic storytelling. You step carefully along the smooth stone floor, listening to the soft swish of her robes echo against walls adorned with charts of constellations, planets, and wandering stars. Each telescope and celestial chart demands precise attention. Hestia adjusts lenses, straightens charts, and ensures that alignment markers and observation tools are perfectly positioned. Fringe legends claim that instruments tended by Hestia provided more accurate readings of celestial movements, though scholars still debate whether this was literal belief or allegorical guidance. You trudge behind her, noticing the faint glimmer of polished bronze, the delicate shimmer of starlight on crystal lenses, and the hypnotic cadence of repeated, deliberate gestures. She pauses at a particularly large telescope, aligning the mirrors with meticulous care, polishing the brass fittings, and ensuring that observation charts are correctly positioned nearby. Fringe myths insist that even minor corrections could influence the accuracy of omens or forecasts, though historians remain divided on whether this notion was literal or symbolic. You trudge along, captivated by the subtle interplay of light, metal, and glass, the soft hum of quiet machinery, and the meditative rhythm of meticulous attention. Hestia moves from instrument to instrument, adjusting sextants, astrolabes, and smaller telescopes, aligning each so that precision and symmetry are maintained throughout the observatory. Fringe accounts suggest that even slight misalignments could symbolically obscure celestial patterns, though scholars still argue whether these stories were literal, instructional, or metaphorical. You trudge behind her, absorbed in the hypnotic repetition, the faint whir of polished gears, and the soothing interplay of light and shadow across brass and glass. Occasionally, a chart tilts or a lens slips slightly. Hestia kneels gracefully, adjusting, realigning, and polishing each instrument to maintain perfect harmony. Fringe legends claim that her subtle interventions radiated clarity and focus, though historians remain uncertain whether this was literal belief or poetic metaphor. You trudge alongside her, noticing the rhythmic cadence of repeated motion, the soft glimmer of metal and crystal, and the meditative effect of methodical care applied to instruments of cosmic observation. She pauses at a globe of constellations, brushing dust from its surface, realigning markers, and smoothing the positions of miniature orbs representing planets. Fringe tales suggest that observations conducted with instruments attended by Hestia were subtly more precise, though scholars still debate whether this is literal, symbolic, or narrative flourish. You trudge behind her, mesmerized by the faint gleam of polished brass, the subtle reflection of starlight, and the hypnotic cadence of repeated, meticulous motion. By the time she finishes, every telescope, chart, and instrument gleams perfectly aligned, and the observatory radiates calm, focus, and precise order. Fringe myths claim that mortal or divine observers might sense subtle clarity or enhanced perception, while historians still debate whether such tales are symbolic, ritualistic, or literal. You trudge alongside her, absorbing the quiet rhythm of repeated attention, the interplay of sight, scent, and sound, and the satisfaction of witnessing diligence transform potential chaos into serene order. Finally, Hestia steps back, surveying the celestial observatory with a faint, serene smile. You realize that even repetitive, seemingly trivial errands aligning, polishing, adjusting, carry quiet, enduring influence. Fringe accounts insist that clarity and calm radiate from her work long after she leaves. While historians still debate whether this is metaphorical or reflects ritual observation, you trudge beside her, drowsy, reflective, and quietly enchanted by the hypnotic, methodical rhythm of domestic diligence magnified to divine scale. You trudge behind Hestia as she approaches the final stretch of her endless errands, the celestial terraces overlooking Olympus, where the wind carries the faint scent of distant seas flowering, gardens, and the soft warmth of the sun lingering on stone. Fringe myths suggest that even the terraces themselves would settle into harmony under her steps. Though historians still argue whether this is literal belief or symbolic storytelling, you step carefully along the marble paths, the soft swish of her robes blending with the gentle rustle of leaves and the distant, sleepy hum of the mountain, drawing your senses into a slow, rhythmic calm. Each section of the terraces demands precise attention. Hestia straightens balustrades, brushes dust from carved stone, and adjusts small lanterns so that their light falls evenly, casting symmetrical patterns on the floor. Fringe legends claim that terraces tended by Hestia subtly influenced the mood of all who gazed upon them, though scholars still debate whether this is literal belief or poetic metaphor. You trudge behind her, noticing the interplay of sunlight and shadow, the soft glimmer of polished stone, and the hypnotic cadence of repeated, deliberate movements. She pauses at a corner where flower beds meet stone, gently repositioning blooms, smoothing petals, and nudging fallen leaves into neat patterns. Fringe myths insist that even minor corrections here could enhance the sense of tranquility for gods and mortals alike, though historians remain divided on whether this notion was literal or allegorical. You trudge along, captivated by the subtle interplay of color, texture, and scent, and the meditative rhythm of her meticulous attention. Hestia moves along the terraces, adjusting benches, arranging small offerings, and straightening decorative ornaments so that each segment radiates harmony. Fringe accounts suggest that even a small misalignment could symbolically disturb serenity, though scholars still argue whether these stories were literal, allegorical, or narrative flourishes. You trudge behind her, absorbed in the hypnotic repetition, the soft rustle of robes, and the soothing interplay of light, scent, and motion. Occasionally, a petal falls out of place or a lantern tilts slightly. Hestia kneels gracefully, smoothing, nudging, and restoring balance with precise, fluid gestures. Fringe legends claim that her subtle interventions radiated calm across the mountain, though historians remain uncertain whether this was literal belief or poetic metaphor. You trudge alongside her, noticing the gentle repetition, the interplay of sunlight and mist, and the meditative cadence of repeated, meticulous care. She pauses at the highest terrace, where the view stretches across Olympus, and beyond, adjusting small stones, brushing dust from balustrades, and aligning tiny offerings so that everything appears perfectly harmonious from every angle. Fringe tales suggest that Hestia's presence enhanced the perception of balance and serenity in the landscape, though scholars still debate whether this is literal, symbolic, or narrative flourish. You trudge behind her, mesmerized by the faint sparkle of sunlight on stone, the soft scent of flowers, and the hypnotic rhythm of repeated, careful motions. By the time she finishes, every flower bed, stone, bench, and lantern gleams with quiet order, and the terraces radiate calm, symmetry, and gentle majesty. Fringe myths claim that mortals or gods glimpsing these terraces might feel subtle peace and balance. while historians still debate whether such tales are symbolic, ritualistic, or literal. You trudge alongside her, absorbing the gentle rhythm of repeated attention, the interplay of sight, scent, and sound, and the quiet satisfaction of witnessing diligence transform potential disorder into serene order. Finally, Hestia steps back, surveying the terraces with a faint, serene smile. You realize that even repetitive, seemingly trivial errand straightening, smoothing, adjusting carry, quiet, enduring influence, fringe accounts insist that calm and harmony radiate from her work long after she leaves, while historians still debate whether this is metaphorical or reflects ritual observation. You trudge beside her, drowsy, reflective, and quietly enchanted by the hypnotic, methodical rhythm of domestic diligence magnified to divine scale. Now, the pace slows almost imperceptibly as you walk beside Hestia across the final terraces. The wind brushing softly against your skin and carrying the faint, sweet scent of distant flowers. Each breath seems lighter, each step gentler, and the distant echoes of your movement fade into a whisper. The golden light of Olympus warms the marble underfoot, and the shadows of statues stretch lazily across the ground, casting a soft, reassuring pattern that feels almost like a lullaby. You notice the delicate sway of leaves in the gardens below, the glimmer of sunlight on polished stone, and the faint, rhythmic hum of the mountain settling into evening calm. You trudge along slowly, aware of the gentle rustle of Hestia's robes, the faint sparkle of golden balustrades, and the subtle shimmer of flowers perfectly aligned beneath her watchful care. The world seems to stretch wider, calmer, as if each precise motion she performed has left an invisible thread of order and peace in the air. Historians still debate whether these subtle effects were ever intended as literal influence or poetic metaphor. But you feel them nonetheless, quiet, pervasive sense of alignment and safety. Fringe legends insist that mortals glimpsing such order might carry a spark of calm back to their own lives, and you can almost sense it wrapping softly around your consciousness. The terraces themselves seem to exhale in quiet satisfaction, every stone, lantern, and flower bed settled into its proper place, reflecting Hestia's methodical care. Your steps grow slower, your eyelids heavier, as the soothing rhythm of her errands the alignment. The smoothing, the gentle adjustments settles into your own mind. The world outside seems distant, unhurried, as if Olympus itself has paused to breathe alongside you. Even the faint wind feels like a gentle nudge toward rest, carrying away tension with each sighing gust. You notice the subtle play of light across the horizon, a final shimmer before twilight fully descends and the sense of calm deepens. Each meticulous gesture Hestia performed resonates quietly, threading the day's endless errands into a single, gentle cadence. The world seems quieter, slower, and your heartbeat matches the soft, deliberate rhythm of her movements, drawing you toward rest. You feel the lingering reassurance of order, of attention carefully applied, and of the comforting certainty that some things like Hestia's quiet diligence endure, beyond awareness, and so you settle into this calm, letting your thoughts drift lazily, softening, lengthening. The air is warmer, softer, your muscles release, and even the faintest sounds, the rustle of leaves, the hum of stone, the shimmer of light, become part of the gentle lullaby. Each detail Hestia tended now lingers in memory as soft comfort. The polished instruments, the aligned terraces, the dusted scrolls, and the shimmering fountains, all folded into an invisible rhythm of serenity. You feel that same order settling inside you, a quiet reassurance that everything can be gently restored, adjusted, and aligned at least for tonight. You exhale slowly, sinking deeper into this sense of calm. Twilight deepens. The terraces stretch onward, quiet and still, and Hestia's faint, serene smile seems to linger even as your eyes close. Your thoughts dissolve gently, one by one, into a soft, steady rhythm of peace, letting sleep take hold. There is nothing left to do, no rush, no chaos, just the slow, rhythmic pulse of calm spreading softly from terrace to terrace, through every breath until the world outside feels far away.